Somewhere in the rugged highlands of northwestern Anatolia, in the final years of the 13th century, a small band of Turkish warriors gathered around a chieftain named Osman. They had no capital city, no treasury worth speaking of, no navy, no palace, and no formal bureaucracy. Their entire domain could be crossed on horseback in a matter of days. They were, by almost every measurable standard, an unremarkable footnote in a world full of much larger, much older, and much more powerful states. And yet, from this near invisible starting point, what Osman and his successors built would eventually span 3 continents, encompass 50 million people, control the most strategic waterways on Earth, and shape the political and cultural landscape of the entire known world for more than 600 years. The Ottoman Empire would outlast the Mongols, the Crusaders, the Byzantine Greeks, the Mamluk sultans of Egypt, the medieval kingdoms of Hungary and Serbia, and the Renaissance principalities of Italy. It would survive earthquakes, plagues, famines, rebellions, coups, civil wars, and the relentless pressure of rival empires pressing in from every direction. It would give the world a model of religious coexistence that, for all its imperfections, no other empire of its era could match. It would produce poets, architects, admirals, astronomers, philosophers, and legal scholars whose contributions still echo today. And when it finally did collapse, the reverberations of that collapse are still being felt in the Middle East, the Balkans, North Africa, and the Caucasus right now, in the 21st century. This is the story of how all of that happened. And it begins not with a dynasty, but with a geography. Anatolia is one of those places that seems almost designed by nature to produce empire. The great peninsula that juts westward from the Asian landmass forms a natural bridge between Europe and Asia, a place where continents collide and civilizations have always been forced to interact. To the north lies the Black Sea, to the south the Mediterranean, and to the west the Aegean. The land itself is extraordinarily varied. Fertile river valleys where crops flourish and cities can sustain themselves, high central plateaus where the winters are brutal and the summers baking, mountain ranges that channel armies down predictable corridors, and coastal plains where trade routes terminate in busy ports. For thousands of years, whoever controlled Anatolia controlled the flow of goods, armies, and ideas between East and West. The Hittites understood this. So did the Persians, the Greeks, the Romans, and the Byzantines after them. By the time Osman was born, around 1258, Anatolia had already hosted more empires than most regions of the earth accumulate in recorded history. But the Anatolia of the late 13th century was not the stable, well-governed Anatolia of earlier centuries. It was a world in spectacular, disorienting collapse. The great Seljuk Sultanate of Rum, which had dominated central and eastern Anatolia since the 11th century and had given the peninsula something resembling political order, was falling apart. The Seljuks had built an impressive state, constructing caravanserais along trade routes, patronizing scholars and poets at their court in Konya, and holding back the fractious nomadic Turkish tribes that continuously streamed in from the east. For nearly 2 centuries, they had been the dominant power in Anatolia. But empires are only as strong as the forces that pressure them from outside, and the force pressing on the Seljuks in the mid-13th century was unlike anything the region had seen in living memory. The Mongols came out of the east like a geological event, something so catastrophic and so total that contemporaries struggled to find language adequate to describe it. Under Genghis Khan, and then his successors, the Mongol armies had already destroyed the great Islamic cities of Central Asia, sacked Baghdad in 1258, and killed the Abbasid Caliph, depopulated swaths of Persia, and sent shockwaves through every political system between China and the Mediterranean. In 1243, at the Battle of Qusaydah, the Mongols crushed the Seljuk army so completely that the Sultanate of Rum was effectively reduced to a vassal state overnight. The Seljuk sultans continued to rule in name for another few decades, but the real power had shifted to the Mongol Ilkhanate based in Persia, and the administrative coherence of the Seljuk state simply evaporated. What followed was something that political historians call fragmentation, but which, from the perspective of people living through it, looked more like the world coming apart at its seams. As Seljuk authority collapsed, Anatolia splintered into a patchwork of small independent Turkish principalities known as beyliks. Each beylik was centered on a particular town or region and ruled by a dynasty of Turkish chieftains who had carved out their territory through a mixture of military force, political maneuvering, and opportunistic expansion into the vacuum left by Seljuk collapse. By the end of the 13th century, there were perhaps a dozen of these beyliks scattered across Anatolia, each one competing with the others for resources, territory, and prestige. They bore names that have mostly been forgotten by everyone except specialists: the Germanids, the Karamanids, the Sarukhanids, the Eretnades. And among them, barely noticed, was a tiny beylik on the northwestern frontier that would eventually swallow all the others. The Kai tribe, to which Osman belonged, had arrived in Anatolia as part of the great westward migration of Turkic peoples that the Mongol upheaval had set in motion. Osman's father, Ertuğrul, had been granted a small territory around the town of Söğüt by the Seljuks, probably as a reward for military service as a frontier warrior. The Kai occupied a position that was, geographically speaking, both precarious and advantageous. They sat on the very edge of Byzantine territory, the buffer zone where the surviving remnants of the Christian Roman Empire met the Turkish Muslim world. This was a liminal space, a frontier, and frontiers operate by their own rules. The concept that historians use to understand what the Ottomans were doing in these early decades is the Ghazi tradition. The word Ghazi referred to a warrior who fought on behalf of Islam against non-Muslim enemies, and the frontier zone between the Islamic Turkish world and the Byzantine Christian world was understood in religious terms as a space of perpetual sacred warfare. Ghazis were men who dedicated themselves to this struggle, raiding into Byzantine territory, capturing booty, taking slaves, and pushing the frontier of Muslim settlement ever further west. The ideology was real, and it mattered, but historians are careful to point out that it existed alongside much more pragmatic motivations. Ghazi warfare was also an economic activity that provided income, prestige, and social mobility for men who had few other options. It attracted recruits from across the Muslim world, men who arrived on the frontier not necessarily because they burned with religious zeal, but because that was where opportunity lay. The Ghazi tradition was real, but it was never purely religious, and the Ottomans were from the very beginning a more complicated phenomenon than simple religious warriors. Osman himself is a figure half lost in legend. The sources we have for his life are thin and often contradictory, and much of what was written about him was composed long after his death, shaped by the dynastic mythology that later Ottoman rulers wanted to project backward onto their founding ancestor. The famous dream story, in which a young Osman sees a moon emerging from the chest of a holy man and entering his own chest, then rising and expanding until it covers the whole world, is almost certainly a later invention designed to give cosmological significance to the Ottoman dynasty. But even through the layer of legend, certain things about Osman emerge clearly. He was a skilled military leader who understood how to use the frontier to his advantage. He cultivated relationships with other local powers, both Muslim and Christian. He was flexible and pragmatic. And at some point, probably in the 1290s, he began acting less like a tribal chieftain and more like something approaching a ruler with an independent political agenda. The first datable event in Ottoman history that we can attach to something like a real chronology is a battle at Baphius in 1302, where an Ottoman force defeated a Byzantine army near the Sea of Marmara. This was not a massive battle by the standards of the era, but its significance was enormous. It demonstrated that the Byzantines could not hold their Anatolian frontier, and it opened the floodgates. Byzantine towns and fortresses across the northwestern corner of Anatolia began surrendering or being abandoned as the populations fled west. Christian communities that had existed in these territories for centuries simply dissolved, either converting, fleeing, or being absorbed into the expanding Ottoman sphere. The process was not always violent. Many communities negotiated terms, and some continued to function more or less as they had before, paying taxes to new masters rather than old ones. But the demographic and religious transformation of the region was rapid, and in historical terms, remarkably thorough. What made Osman's beylik different from the others spreading across Anatolia at this time? Historians have debated this question intensively for generations, and there is no simple answer. Geography played a role, since proximity to the Byzantine frontier meant a steady supply of raiding opportunities and a constant influx of warriors seeking action and profit. Leadership mattered too. Osman seems to have been genuinely talented at building coalitions, attracting followers, and keeping them loyal. There was also something about the Ottoman approach to newly conquered territories that proved more sustainable than the pure raiding model practiced by some rivals. Rather than simply stripping communities of their wealth and moving on, the early Ottomans developed practices for incorporating conquered peoples into their system, offering protection in exchange for tax revenue, allowing local elites to maintain their status if they acknowledged Ottoman authority. It was empire building at a small scale, but it was recognizably empire building. When Osman died, probably around 1326, he left behind a state that was still tiny by world historical standards, but that had established patterns and institutions that his successors would dramatically expand. The most important inheritance he left was not territory, but a political culture, flexible, pragmatic, militarily aggressive, and surprisingly tolerant of diversity in the communities it absorbed. Orhan, Osman's son and successor, picked up this inheritance and immediately began to demonstrate what Ottoman power could accomplish at a slightly larger scale. In 1326, the same year his father died, Orhan captured Bursa, the first genuinely significant city to fall under Ottoman control. Bursa was not a frontier town. It was a major Byzantine city with real urban infrastructure, skilled craftsmen, a monetized economy, and a population accustomed to sophisticated administration. Taking Bursa meant the Ottomans had to figure out how to govern a real city, and the way they handled this challenge reveals a great deal about why their empire proved so durable. Rather than destroying Bursa's existing structures, Orhan largely preserved them. The Byzantine administrators who remained were incorporated into the new system. Churches were converted into mosques, but the Christian population was not expelled. The city's markets continued to function. Trade routes that had made Bursa prosperous under Byzantine rule continued to enrich it under Ottoman rule, just with different masters collecting the tolls and tariffs. Orhan made Bursa his capital, and he began doing something that Osman had never done. He started building. Mosques, soup kitchens, caravanserais, religious schools, and bathhouses began to appear in Bursa, giving it an unmistakably Ottoman character while preserving its economic vitality. This pattern, absorb, adapt, build, repeat, would define Ottoman expansion for the next several centuries. Orhan was also the first Ottoman ruler to take a serious step toward institutionalizing military power in a way that transcended the tribal model. Under the early Ghazi system, warriors fought for their chieftain in exchange for a share of booty, and they could, in principle, walk away when the campaigning season ended. This was sustainable for raiding, but inadequate for governing a growing territory. Orhan began developing a more permanent military establishment, including early versions of the mounted cavalry units that would become a major feature of later Ottoman armies. He also established the first Ottoman coinage, a critical marker of sovereign status, and began formalizing the bureaucratic structures that a real state required. None of this was done all at once. The process was gradual, improvised, and full of contradiction, but the direction was unmistakable. Orhan's relationship with the Byzantine Empire was complicated and, by later standards, surprisingly warm. He married a Byzantine princess named Theodora, the daughter of the Emperor John VI Cantacuzene, and the two men actually cooperated on several occasions, with Orhan's forces serving as auxiliaries in Byzantine internal conflicts. This was not unique or scandalous in the medieval world, where religious identity was one factor among many in political calculation and where rulers routinely made alliances across confessional lines when it suited their interests. But it does tell us something important. From very early in their history, the Ottomans were a state that operated in both the Muslim and Christian worlds simultaneously, navigating between them with a sophistication that pure ideological models cannot account for. The most consequential move Orhan made was to cross the Dardanelles. In 1352 or thereabouts, Ottoman forces under Orhan's son Suleiman established a permanent foothold on the European side of the strait, at the fortress of Chimpe. It is almost impossible to overstate the significance of this moment. For centuries, the Byzantine world had imagined the sea as a defensive barrier, a moat protecting Christian Europe from the Islamic East. The Ottomans had just crossed the moat. Within a few years, Suleiman had pushed deeper into the Balkans, capturing the major city of Edirne, which the Ottomans called Adrianople, in what is now northwestern Turkey. Not far from the Bulgarian and Greek borders, the direction of Ottoman ambition was now unmistakable. It was under Murad I, who became Sultan after Orhan's death in 1362, that the Ottoman expansion into Europe became systematic and relentless. Murad was one of the genuinely remarkable rulers of the medieval world, a man who combined military genius with administrative creativity and a political instinct that repeatedly outmaneuvered opponents who should have had every advantage. Under his rule, the Ottomans developed two innovations that would define their empire for centuries. The first was the Janissary Corps. The second was the Devshirme system that fed it. The word Janissary comes from the Turkish yeni çeri, meaning new soldiers, and that name captures something essential about what these troops were designed to be. Something entirely new. A professional standing army, loyal not to a tribe or a clan or a feudal lord, but directly to the Sultan himself. The Janissaries were recruited through the Devshirme, a levy imposed on the Christian populations of Ottoman-controlled territories in the Balkans. Young boys, usually between the ages of 8 and 18, were taken from their families, converted to Islam, educated in Ottoman palace schools, trained in military skills, and integrated into an institution that became their entire world. They could not marry during their active service, could not engage in trade, and had no family ties that might divide their loyalty. Everything they had came from the Sultan, and everything they did was in the Sultan's service. The moral complexity of the Devshirme is something historians have wrestled with seriously. From one perspective, it was a form of child slavery, a coercive system that forcibly separated children from their parents and their communities. From another perspective, the boys selected for Devshirme were entering a pathway to real power and privilege. Many of the most powerful men in the Ottoman Empire, including grand viziers and generals, rose from Devshirme origins. Some families in the Balkans reportedly tried to get their sons selected, seeing it as an opportunity rather than a punishment. The reality was probably both things at once, a system that was genuinely coercive and genuinely offered advancement in ways that other paths did not. What it unquestionably produced was a military and administrative elite of extraordinary quality, men who had been trained from childhood for exactly the roles they occupied, and who had no competing loyalties to undermine their service. Under Murad I, the Janissaries became the elite core of an army that proved devastatingly effective against the coalition forces of Christian Europe. The Balkans in the 14th century were a patchwork of small, competing states: Serbian kingdoms, Bulgarian tsardoms, Byzantine remnants, Wallachian principalities, Greek despotates, and Hungarian territories, none of which were capable of presenting a united front against the Ottomans. Murad exploited this fragmentation with ruthless efficiency, playing rivals against each other, offering favorable terms to states that submitted peacefully, and crushing those that resisted. By the 1380s, the Ottomans had reduced Bulgaria to a vassal state, brought much of Macedonia and Thrace under direct control, and were pressing deep into Serbia. The Battle of Kosovo in 1389 is one of those events that echoes so far beyond its immediate military significance that separating historical fact from legend requires real effort. What we know is that on the 28th of June 1389, on the Field of Blackbirds in what is now Kosovo, a large Ottoman army under Murad met a coalition of Balkan Christian forces led by the Serbian Prince Lazar. The battle was fierce, and its outcome was in some ways ambiguous. Both sides suffered catastrophic losses, and Murad himself was killed, probably assassinated by a Serbian nobleman either during or immediately after the battle. But strategically, the result was an Ottoman victory. Lazar was captured and executed, the Serbian coalition was broken, and Kosovo became an Ottoman vassal. The Ottomans would continue pushing into Serbia and deeper into the Balkans in the years that followed. But Kosovo acquired a significance in Serbian national consciousness that no military outcome can fully explain. For Serbs, Kosovo became the defining event of their history, a moment of sacred sacrifice and heroic defeat that has been reimagined and reinterpreted in poetry, music, and political rhetoric for more than 6 centuries. The epic cycle of Kosovo poetry transformed the historical battle into something approaching myth, a cosmic confrontation between Christian civilization and Muslim power, a moment when the heavenly kingdom was chosen over the earthly one. This mythology was revived with particular intensity in the 19th century during the Serbian national awakening, and it was invoked again with devastating consequences in the 1990s, when Slobodan Milosevic used the 600th anniversary of Kosovo to rally Serbian nationalism in ways that helped trigger the Yugoslav wars. Few medieval battles have continued to shape contemporary politics as directly as Kosovo, and understanding why requires understanding not just what happened in 1389, but what people in different centuries needed that event to mean. Murad was succeeded by his son Bayezid I, nicknamed Yildirim, meaning thunderbolt, for the speed and ferocity of his military campaigns. Bayezid was a sultan of enormous energy and ambition, someone who understood that the momentum of Ottoman expansion needed to be maintained or it would dissipate. He continued pushing into the Balkans, completing the subjugation of Bulgaria, and simultaneously began pressing hard against the remaining Byzantine territory, essentially reducing Constantinople to an isolated city surrounded by Ottoman land with only its walls and its seaward approaches keeping it alive. He maintained a years-long blockade of the city, which would have ended Byzantine history a full 6 decades before it actually did, had other events not intervened. Those other events were coming from the east. While Bayezid was occupied in Europe, the horizon of Anatolia was darkening, with a threat that the Ottomans were not yet large enough to absorb. Timur, known in the West as Tamerlane, was a Central Asian conqueror of staggering ferocity who had built an empire stretching from Persia to India to the Caucasus and who was now turning his attention westward. Unlike many of the rulers the Ottomans had encountered, Timur was not someone who could be bought off, pacified, or outmaneuvered through the normal toolkit of Ottoman diplomacy. He was a man who destroyed cities that resisted him and built towers of skulls as architectural statements. The two empires were on a collision course, and the collision came at the Battle of Ankara in 1402. It was one of the most consequential battles of the 15th century. Timur's forces were not just superior in numbers, they had also made diplomatic contact with Anatolian beyliks that the Ottomans had absorbed or suppressed, and several of these vassal forces switched sides during the battle itself. The Ottoman army was shattered. Bayezid was captured, the first Ottoman sultan ever to be taken prisoner, and he died in Timur's custody within months, possibly from illness, possibly from the psychological devastation of his defeat. The empire that Murad and Bayezid had spent decades building appeared, in the immediate aftermath of Ankara, to be on the verge of complete dissolution. What followed is known in Ottoman history as the Interregnum, a period of roughly a decade from 1402 to 1413, during which Bayezid's sons fought each other for control of the remnants of their father's empire. It was a civil war of particular savagery, a struggle in which brothers had brothers killed, alliances shifted constantly, and outside powers intervened when they saw opportunity. The Byzantine Empire, which had been on the verge of final extinction before Ankara, found itself briefly reprieved as the Ottoman princes competed for its support. Timur himself deliberately encouraged the fragmentation, recognizing that a divided Ottoman state served his interests better than a unified one. That the empire survived this period at all is remarkable. That it not only survived, but recovered, consolidated, and went on to greater conquests, is the kind of thing that invites serious historical reflection. The institutional framework that the Ottomans had built, the bureaucratic structures, the janissary system, the system of provincial administration, the economic networks, the legitimizing ideology of frontier Islam, all of this proved resilient enough to outlast the chaos of the interregnum. When Mehmed I finally defeated his brothers and reunified the empire in 1413, he inherited a damaged but fundamentally intact state. His son Murad II would repair and strengthen it further. And then Murad II's son would do something that would make the whole world pay attention to the Ottoman Empire in a way it never had before. His name was Mehmed II, and he became sultan for the first time in 1444 at the age of 12, when his father Murad II temporarily abdicated in what appears to have been a genuine attempt to step back from the burdens of rule. The experiment lasted barely 2 years. A crusade organized by Western Christian powers forced Murad to return, and Mehmed was sent back to study and wait. When Murad died in 1451, Mehmed became sultan again, this time permanently, and the first thing he did, before almost anything else, was begin planning the conquest of Constantinople. The city that Mehmed wanted had been the capital of the Roman Empire for over 1,000 years. Constantine the Great had founded it in 330 CE on the narrow strip of land between the Golden Horn and the Sea of Marmara, recognizing immediately the extraordinary strategic advantages of the site. The city commanded the strait connecting the Black Sea to the Mediterranean, which meant it commanded one of the most important trade routes in the world. Its triangular peninsula was protected on 2 sides by water, and on the third by the famous Theodosian walls, a system of fortifications built in the 5th century that consisted of 3 concentric rings of walls separated by ditches and towers. A defensive complex so formidable that it had never been successfully stormed by a conventional assault in over 1,000 years. Constantinople had repelled Arabs, Bulgars, Rus, Avars, and Persians. The only time it had fallen, in 1204, was to the Fourth Crusade, and that attack had come from the sea. The land walls had remained unbroken. By 1451, the Byzantine Empire that Constantinople nominally ruled was a ghost of its former self. The actual territory under direct Byzantine control consisted of the city itself, a small strip of Thrace nearby, and a few scattered islands and coastal enclaves. The Emperor Constantine II Palaiologos, the last Byzantine emperor, ruled a population of perhaps 50,000 people in a city that had once housed 500,000. Great swaths of formerly populated neighborhoods within the Theodosian walls had reverted to farmland and gardens. The Hagia Sophia, the great cathedral that had been the spiritual heart of Byzantine Christianity for 9 centuries, was in a state of partial ruin after an earthquake damaged its dome. The treasury was essentially empty, and yet Constantinople retained its symbolic importance, which was enormous. For the Christian world, it was the Second Rome, the city of the emperor, the seat of a tradition of Christian civilization stretching back to Constantine himself. For the Muslim world, it was a prize whose conquest had been prophesied, and the Ottoman sultans were acutely aware that whoever conquered it would inherit a legitimacy that no other Muslim ruler could claim. Mehmed prepared for the siege with a methodical attention to detail that suggests a military mind of the first order. He commissioned the construction of a massive new fortress, Rumeli Hisara, on the European shore of the Bosphorus, just north of Constantinople, directly opposite the existing Anatolian fortress Anadolu Hisara. Together, the 2 fortresses gave the Ottomans complete control of the Bosphorus, cutting off Constantinople from any supply or reinforcement coming through the Black Sea. The construction of Rumeli Hisara took only 4 months, a pace that required an extraordinary logistical effort and demonstrated the organizational capacity the Ottoman state had developed. But the true secret weapon Mehmed deployed was artillery, and specifically the work of a Hungarian engineer named Urban, who had first offered his services to the Byzantine emperor and, finding that the Byzantines could not pay him adequately, had come to Mehmed's court instead. Urban built for Mehmed a cannon so large that it required 60 oxen and several hundred men to move, a weapon that fired stone balls weighing over half a ton. When tested near Edirne, it reportedly shook the ground for miles around and could be heard from a great distance. The Byzantines had never faced anything remotely like it. The Theodosian walls had been built to withstand the siege technology of the 5th century, and nothing in the 1,500 years since had required them to be fundamentally redesigned. Urban's cannon changed the equation completely. The Ottoman fleet gathered, an armada of several hundred ships that would blockade the city from the sea while the army besieged it from the land. The Byzantine defenders, numbering perhaps 7,000 fighting men, including a contingent of Genoese mercenaries under the brilliant commander Giovanni Giustiniani, prepared to hold the longest set of walls they were capable of manning. Constantine VII appealed desperately to the Western powers for help. He received almost nothing. The theological schism between the Orthodox and Catholic churches had poisoned relations between Constantinople and Rome for centuries, and despite a formal attempt at reunion in 1439, the Orthodox population of Constantinople largely preferred Muslim rule to submission to Rome. A famous line attributed to the period captures the sentiment: they would rather see the turban of the Turk in the city than the cardinal's hat. The siege began in early April 1453. For weeks, Mehmed's great cannons pounded the Theodosian walls, creating breaches that the defenders frantically filled each night with rubble and earth. The fighting was desperate, and, by all accounts, the Byzantine defenders and their Genoese allies fought with extraordinary courage given the hopelessness of their situation. Giustiniani was wounded in the later stages of the siege, and his withdrawal from the walls is usually cited as a critical moment that preceded the final Ottoman breakthrough. On the morning of the 29th of May, 1453, Ottoman forces broke through the walls in multiple places simultaneously. Constantine XI reportedly removed his imperial insignia and threw himself into the fighting, and was never seen alive again. His body was never definitively identified, and almost immediately a legend grew that he had not died, but had been turned to marble and placed under the Golden Gate, waiting to return when Constantinople was liberated. It was the kind of story that defeat generates, a mythologized refusal to accept the finality of what had happened. What happened inside Constantinople in the immediate aftermath of the breakthrough was, by the standards of medieval siege warfare, not unusually brutal. Mehmed had promised his soldiers 3 days of plunder, which was standard practice for a city taken by storm. There was looting, killing, and enslavement. But the violence was not unlimited. Mehmed entered the city on the afternoon of May 29, rode directly to the Hagia Sophia, and had it converted to a mosque, with the call to prayer sounded from its minarets. Then he issued orders protecting the remaining population and the infrastructure of the city. He wanted a functioning capital, not a ruin. The consequences of the fall of Constantinople reverberated immediately and profoundly across the known world. In Europe, the news was received with shock and horror. The Pope called for a new crusade. Scholars and humanists mourned what they described as the second death of Homer and Plato, since many Greek manuscripts and scholars had been concentrated in Constantinople. Some historians have credited the fall of the city with accelerating the Italian Renaissance, as Greek scholars fled westward bringing classical texts and knowledge with them, though this argument overstates how tightly knowledge was tied to one city by that point. More practically, the fall of Constantinople fundamentally altered the balance of power in the Eastern Mediterranean and raised a question that European rulers would wrestle with for the next 2 centuries. How do you deal with an Ottoman Empire that is now clearly the dominant power from the Danube to the Euphrates? For the Ottomans themselves, the conquest was transformative in ways that went far beyond the strategic value of the city. Mehmed II took the title Caesar of Rome, Kaiser-i Rom in Turkish, and he meant it seriously. He saw himself not as the destroyer of Roman civilization, but as its inheritor, a successor to the Roman imperial tradition through conquest rather than through lineage. He brought Greek scholars to his court, commissioned a translation of Greek geographical texts, reportedly read histories of Alexander the Great with great interest, and imagined Ottoman power in genuinely universal terms. The conquests he planned and executed after 1453, campaigns into Serbia, into the Morea in Greece, into Trebizond on the Black Sea coast, into Wallachia, into Bosnia, into Albania, into the Crimea, were the campaigns of someone who intended to recreate something approaching a universal empire centered on Constantinople, now renamed Istanbul, from the Greek phrase Eis tin Polin, meaning to the city. Not everything Mehmed attempted succeeded. His 1,480 attempt to take the island of Rhodes, held by the Knights Hospitaller, failed after a determined defense. An Ottoman landing in southern Italy at Otranto was eventually reversed after Mehmed's death. But the overall record of expansion during his reign was extraordinary. He nearly doubled the territory of the empire he inherited and established Ottoman power as a permanent and dominant feature of the Eastern Mediterranean world. When he died in 1481, possibly poisoned, the world was a fundamentally different place from the one into which he had been born. The decades after Mehmed II's death were marked by a struggle for succession between his sons Cem and Bayezid II, and by a period of somewhat more cautious expansion as the new sultan consolidated rather than dramatically extended his inheritance. But the Ottoman state under Bayezid II continued to develop its administrative sophistication, and there was one event during his reign that, though it received little fanfare at the time, would prove enormously consequential for the long-term demographic and economic shape of the empire. In 1492, Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain completed the Reconquista and expelled the Jews from their kingdom. Bayezid II actively welcomed the expelled Sephardic Jews into the Ottoman Empire, reportedly saying that the Spanish monarchs were impoverishing their own kingdom while enriching his. Tens of thousands of Jewish refugees settled in Ottoman cities, particularly in Istanbul and Salonika, bringing with them skills in medicine, finance, printing, and international trade that enriched the empire substantially. The Ottoman welcome of these refugees was partly humanitarian and partly supremely practical. The sultans understood that a skilled, commercially connected diaspora population was a genuine economic asset. The sultan who followed Bayezid was nothing like his cautious father. Selim I, who seized power in 1512 by forcing his father to abdicate and having his brothers executed, was a man of extraordinary intensity, a poet in Persian and Turkish, a ruthless military commander, and a strategic thinker who completely reoriented Ottoman ambition from its traditional westward and European direction toward the south and east. In 9 years of rule, Selim transformed the Ottoman Empire from a primarily Anatolian and Balkan power into a Middle Eastern and North African one, and he did it through a series of campaigns of breathtaking speed and audacity. The first target was the Safavid Empire of Persia, ruled by Shah Ismail I, the founder of the Safavid dynasty, and a charismatic religious leader who had made Twelver Shia Islam the state religion of his kingdom. The relationship between the Ottomans and the Safavids was not simply political rivalry. It was also a conflict about the soul of Islam, since the Safavids were aggressively promoting Shia Islam in territories that had been predominantly Sunni, and they were doing so in ways that directly threatened Ottoman authority, particularly among the Turkoman tribal populations of eastern Anatolia, who were sometimes drawn to Safavid religious enthusiasm. Selim's campaign against the Safavids in 1514 culminated at the Battle of Calderan in northwestern Iran, where Ottoman artillery and disciplined infantry destroyed a Safavid cavalry army that refused to accept the tactical limitations that firearms had imposed on the battlefield. Shah Ismail survived, but his aura of invincibility was shattered, and the eastern frontier of Ottoman power was secured, at least temporarily. Selim then turned south. The Mamluk Sultanate of Egypt and Syria was one of the oldest and most prestigious Muslim polities in the world, the state that had defeated the Mongols at Ain Jalut in 1260, and that had governed the Arabic-speaking heartlands of Islam for 2.5 centuries. It controlled Egypt, Syria, and Palestine, including the holy cities of Mecca and Medina and the city of Jerusalem. Taking the Mamluk territories would give the Ottomans control of the most sacred sites of Islam and command over the most important trade routes in the world, specifically the spice trade that flowed from the Indian Ocean through the Red Sea to the Mediterranean. Selim invaded in 1516 with an army whose firearms once again proved decisive against cavalry-based opponents still fighting in the old manner. The Syrian campaign was swift. Egypt fell the following year after the Battle of Ridaniya. The last Mamluk Sultan was captured and executed. The entire Arab heartland of Islam passed under Ottoman control in less than 2 years. Among the more remarkable episodes of this campaign was the fate of the last Abbasid Caliph. The Abbasid Caliphate had been destroyed by the Mongols in 1258 when Baghdad was sacked, but a line of shadow Abbasid caliphs had continued in Cairo under Mamluk patronage, maintaining the symbolic office even without any real power. According to Ottoman tradition, this last Abbasid caliph in Cairo transferred the title and its symbolic insignia to Selim, who was thus claiming not just military supremacy over the Muslim world, but religious leadership as well. Historians debate how significant this transfer actually was at the time, and whether it was understood the way later Ottoman sultans would retrospectively claim it was understood. But whatever the ceremonial reality of the moment, the practical effect was clear. The Ottoman sultans were now by any measure the most powerful rulers in the Islamic world, controlling the holy cities of Mecca, Medina, and Jerusalem, commanding the largest Muslim army and ruling more Muslims than any other state on earth. Selim died in 1520, without having had time to follow up on what he had achieved, reportedly still planning further campaigns. He had tripled the size of the empire in less than a decade. He left the throne to his son Suleiman, who would reign for the next 46 years, longer than any other Ottoman sultan, and who would bring the empire to what almost all historians agree was its peak. Suleiman I is known in Western historical writing as the Magnificent. His own people called him Kanuni, the lawgiver. Both names capture something real about him, but neither captures everything. He was a sultan who understood that an empire the size of the one he had inherited required more than military brilliance to maintain. It required law, administrative order, social contracts that could command genuine loyalty from populations of enormously varied backgrounds. During the first decades of his reign, Suleiman led military campaigns of tremendous ambition, capturing Belgrade in 1521, routing a Hungarian army at the Battle of Mohacs in 1526, and killing the Hungarian king Louis II, and pushing all the way to the gates of Vienna in 1,529 inches, a siege that, had it succeeded, would have opened Central Europe to Ottoman power in ways almost impossible to imagine. The siege of Vienna ultimately failed, primarily because it was too late in the campaigning season and the Ottoman supply lines were too extended. But the fact that it came as close as it did sent a shock wave through Europe that shaped its politics and culture for a century. What distinguished Suleiman from his predecessors was not military accomplishment alone, though his record was extraordinary, but the degree to which he invested in the bureaucratic, legal, and cultural institutions that gave the empire lasting coherence. The legal code he promulgated, the Kanun-i Osmani, organized and systematized Ottoman law in ways that regularized relationships between subjects and state, defined property rights, set tax rates, and established procedures for resolving disputes. This code operated alongside Islamic Sharia law rather than replacing it, creating a dual legal structure that was more sophisticated than many contemporaries recognized. The Sultan's court became a genuinely cosmopolitan space where poets, scholars, architects, and advisors from a dozen different cultural backgrounds competed for patronage and produced work of real quality. Istanbul, under Suleiman, was, by any measure, one of the great cities of the world. No figure in Suleiman's reign was more consequential than his Grand Vizier Ibrahim Pasha, who served in that office from 1523 to 1536, and who was both Suleiman's closest advisor and his genuine friend, a relationship of unusual emotional intimacy that the sources document in ways that later Ottoman conventions would have made impossible to express. Ibrahim was a Devshirme man, born Christian in the Balkans, raised in the palace system, and elevated to the highest administrative office in the empire. He was talented, politically skilled, and almost certainly overconfident about the permanence of his position. In 1536, Suleiman had him executed, the reasons unclear but probably involving a combination of accumulated jealousies, political missteps, and the inherent impossibility of the position he occupied. The execution of Ibrahim was a reminder that in the Ottoman system, proximity to power was simultaneously the greatest opportunity and the greatest danger. The other figure who defined Suleiman's reign in ways that no political history can ignore is Hurrem Sultan, known in Europe as Roxolana. She was a woman from the Ruthenian region of Eastern Europe, brought to the palace harem probably in her teens, and she rose in Suleiman's affections with a speed and completeness that broke every convention of Ottoman court life. The convention was that royal concubines who bore the sultan's sons would then typically avoid bearing further children, to prevent any single woman from accumulating disproportionate influence through multiple male heirs. Hurrem broke this convention completely, bearing Suleiman multiple sons. Even more shockingly, Suleiman married her, an act that had almost no precedent in Ottoman history since Orhan's marriage to Theodora, and which immediately made Hurrem into something new in the Ottoman world. A legal wife, a queen consort, with a formal status that no one quite knew how to categorize. The power Hurrem exercised through her intimate access to the Sultan was real, and it generated real political consequences. She was deeply involved in the struggle over who would succeed Suleiman, and the tragic death of Shehzadeh Mustafa, Suleiman's eldest son and the most obvious candidate for succession, who was executed in 1553 on suspicion of plotting rebellion, has been attributed by many contemporaries and subsequent historians to Hurrem's influence and the influence of her ally and son-in-law, the Grand Vizier Rustem Pasha. Whether this is accurate, or whether it reflects misogynistic assumptions about female influence in court politics, is genuinely contested by scholars. What is clear is that the succession question during Suleiman's reign was extraordinarily fraught, and that when Suleiman died in 1566 on campaign in Hungary, the empire passed to his son Selim II, a man whose abilities as a ruler were distinctly less impressive than those of his father. But before moving to the pressures and contradictions that would eventually erode Ottoman power, it is worth dwelling on what the empire actually was at its height, because its scale and complexity are genuinely staggering. At its greatest extent, in the late 16th century, the Ottoman Empire stretched from the gates of Vienna in the northwest to Basra at the head of the Persian Gulf in the southeast, from Crimea on the Black Sea in the north to the border of Morocco in the west and the Yemeni highlands in the south. It encompassed the Balkans, most of Anatolia, all of the Arabic-speaking Levant, Egypt, most of North Africa's Mediterranean coast, Western Arabia including Mecca and Medina, Mesopotamia, and large portions of the Caucasus. The total population was somewhere between 30 and 50 million people, making it one of the largest political units on Earth, and that population spoke dozens of languages and practiced 3 major world religions, with hundreds of local variants and traditions within each. Governing this diversity was the empire's greatest institutional challenge and, for much of its history, its greatest institutional achievement. The key mechanism was the millet system, a framework for organizing non-Muslim communities as semi-autonomous legal and social units. The Greek Orthodox Christians formed one millet, administered by their own patriarch in Istanbul. The Armenian Christians formed another, administered by the Armenian Patriarch. The Jewish communities formed a third, with their own rabbinical leadership. Each millet was responsible for its own internal religious affairs, education, family law, and certain aspects of personal status. The state collected taxes from each community through its leaders and largely left the internal governance of religious and social matters to those leaders. This was not democracy, and it was not equality. Non-Muslims paid special taxes, including the sizzi or poll tax, that Muslims did not, and there were formal restrictions on non-Muslim public religious expression in some times and places. But it was a framework for coexistence that worked, imperfectly but genuinely, for centuries, and it allowed the empire to absorb populations that no other system of the era could have managed without either mass conversion or mass expulsion. The extraordinary diversity of Istanbul itself illustrates the point. By the 16th century, Istanbul was one of the largest cities in the world, with a population that may have reached 700,000 by 1600, making it substantially larger than any city in Western Europe at that time. The city contained hundreds of mosques, including the great imperial mosques that Suleiman's reign produced. It also contained Greek Orthodox churches, Armenian churches, synagogues, and the great Hagia Sophia itself, now serving as a mosque but still physically dominating the city's skyline as it had done for 1,000 years. The Grand Bazaar, one of the largest covered markets in the world, brought together merchants from every corner of the empire and beyond, trading in silk, spice, gold, silver, ceramics, leather, glass, and an almost inconceivable variety of other goods. The city's harbor, the Golden Horn, was perpetually crowded with ships from Venice, Genoa, France, Egypt, Persia, and the Black Sea ports. To walk through Istanbul in 1550, was to encounter something genuinely unprecedented in world history. A city that was simultaneously Muslim, Christian, Jewish, Turkish, Greek, Arabic, Serbian, Armenian, and a dozen other things at once, held together by a state that had developed the institutional tools to make that coexistence function. The architecture that Suleiman's court produced is the most visible legacy of this era. The genius behind it was Mimar Sinan, arguably the greatest architect in Ottoman history and one of the great architects in any history. Sinan was himself a Devshirme man, born probably in Cappadocia of either Greek or Armenian Christian origins, trained in the palace schools, and initially deployed as a military engineer before his architectural talent became apparent. Over a career that spanned more than 5 decades and extended into extreme old age, Sinan designed and built hundreds of structures across the empire, including mosques, caravanserais, madrasas, bridges, aqueducts, and royal palaces. His masterwork, the Selimi Mosque in Edirne, completed in 1575 when Sinan was in his 80s, is considered by many architects and historians to represent the pinnacle of Ottoman architectural achievement. Its single great dome, flanked by 4 pencil-thin minarets, covers a prayer space of extraordinary luminosity, the light filtering through hundreds of windows in ways that create an atmosphere of serene transcendence. Sinan himself reportedly regarded the Selimiye as his greatest achievement, claiming to have surpassed the dome of the Hagia Sophia, which had tantalized him as a structural challenge for his entire career. The Süleymaniye Mosque in Istanbul, which Sinan designed for Suleiman in the 1550s, is in some ways even more interesting as a statement of imperial intent. It sits on a hill above the Golden Horn, visible from nearly every part of the city, and it is surrounded by a complex of subsidiary buildings that makes it not just a place of worship, but a complete social institution. A hospital, a medical school, a madrasa for religious education, a Quran school, caravanserai, a public kitchen that fed the poor, and a public bath. This was the architecture not just of piety, but of governance, a physical manifestation of the Sultan's obligation to provide for his subjects. The Ottoman sultans built these complexes, called kuliyes, across the empire as a way of establishing imperial presence in newly conquered or consolidated territories, and the cumulative effect was a built environment that communicated Ottoman power and Ottoman Islamic civilization simultaneously. The military power that made all of this possible deserves closer examination because it was both more innovative and more dependent on specific historical conditions than simple accounts of Ottoman military supremacy suggest. The Janissaries were the most famous component, but they were far from the only one. The Ottoman army at its peak was a complex multi-component force that combined Janissary infantry, Sipahi cavalry paid from land grants called timars, artillery units, and a naval component that by the mid-16th century made the Ottomans the dominant power in the Mediterranean. The timar system deserves particular attention because it was the structural backbone of Ottoman provincial government as well as Ottoman military power. The Sipahis, mounted cavalry soldiers, received the right to collect the taxes from a specific piece of agricultural land in exchange for presenting themselves for military service whenever the Sultan called. They were not feudal lords in the Western European sense, since they did not own the land and could not pass it to their heirs automatically, but they occupied a similar functional role as a militarized provincial gentry with an economic stake in maintaining order in the territories they administered. The timar system aligned military obligation with provincial administration in an elegant way, but it also created a class of provincial military men whose power depended on the perpetuation of a particular kind of military and agricultural organization. When circumstances changed in ways that the timar system could not accommodate, this would become a serious problem. The naval dimension of Ottoman power is often overshadowed by the empire's more famous land campaigns, but it was equally central to Ottoman strategic success. The Mediterranean in the 16th century was an arena of continuous naval competition, and the Ottomans competed in it with growing effectiveness as the century progressed. The man most responsible for establishing Ottoman naval dominance was Hayreddin Barbarossa, a man whose origins are somewhat obscure, but who was probably born in the Aegean, possibly of mixed Greek and Turkish parentage, and who, with his brother Arouge, built a formidable corsair operation in North Africa before the Ottomans incorporated them into the imperial navy. Barbarossa brought the experience of irregular naval warfare and deep knowledge of Mediterranean geography to a formal naval establishment that the Ottomans were actively developing, and the combination proved devastating. At the Battle of Preveza in 1538, Barbarossa's Ottoman fleet decisively defeated a combined Christian fleet organized by Pope Paul III, Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, and the Genoese admiral Andrea Doria. The victory gave the Ottomans effective control of the central and eastern Mediterranean for decades. Barbarossa became Grand Admiral of the Ottoman fleet, and his campaigns established Ottoman naval bases across North Africa and brought Algeria under Ottoman suzerainty. The corsair tradition that had made the Barbarossa brothers famous was incorporated into Ottoman strategic planning in ways that made the Ottoman naval presence felt from the Atlantic to the Red Sea. It was not until the Battle of Lepanto in 1571 that a combined Christian fleet under Don John of Austria defeated the Ottoman navy. And even that victory, celebrated enormously in Europe, did not alter Ottoman naval power as much as contemporaries hoped. The fleet was rebuilt within 2 years, and Ottoman naval activity in the Mediterranean continued for decades. The campaign that probably best illustrates both the reach and the limits of Ottoman power was the long struggle over Hungary and the sieges of Vienna. The Battle of Mohacs in 1526 had eliminated Hungary as an independent state and brought the Ottoman frontier to the doorstep of the Habsburg domains. The first siege of Vienna in 1529 failed, but it established a pattern of Ottoman-Habsburg confrontation that would persist for over a century and a half. For the Ottoman sultans, pushing into Central Europe served both strategic and ideological purposes. It continued the Ghazi tradition of expanding the frontier of Muslim power. It threatened the greatest European dynasty, and it kept the Janissaries and other military forces occupied and rewarded. For the Habsburgs, holding the line against Ottoman expansion was simultaneously a military necessity and a sacred obligation. The Holy Roman Emperor was the supposed protector of Christendom, and the Ottoman advance made that role existentially urgent in ways that previous centuries had not. The struggle played out in the endless grinding war of fortresses and raids that characterized the Hungarian frontier for generations. The Ottomans garrisoned the fortresses they captured with Janissary troops and maintained a network of frontier bays responsible for military operations in the border zones. The Habsburgs responded with their own system of frontier fortifications and a military establishment paid for partly by contributions from other European powers, who recognized that the Habsburg frontier was the last line before Ottoman power reached the Rhine. The ordinary people caught between these systems, the Hungarian and Croatian peasants of the frontier zone, suffered immensely, subject to raids from both sides, forced labor obligations, and the constant threat of violence. The greatest logistical challenge the Ottomans faced in their European campaigns was not the quality of their enemies, but the distances their armies had to travel. Istanbul to Vienna is more than 1,500 kilometers. An Ottoman army of the 16th century typically marched from Istanbul in the spring and had to be back before the autumn rains made the roads impassable. The window for effective campaigning in Central Europe was narrow. The supply requirements were enormous, and the further from Istanbul the army marched, the more attenuated its supply lines became. This geographic reality meant that the Second Siege of Vienna in 1683, the last serious Ottoman attempt on the city, was already at the edge of what Ottoman logistics could support even before the battle was joined. When the Ottoman forces were finally defeated by a relief army under the Polish King John III Sobieski in September 1683, it was a military turning point of the First Order. But the logistical constraints that had always made Vienna a maximum range objective were as important as the military defeat in explaining why the Ottomans never tried again. The everyday life of Ottoman subjects was shaped by forces very different from the military campaigns and palace politics that dominate historical narratives. The empire was, above all, an agricultural society, and the vast majority of its population were peasants who grew food, paid taxes, and largely lived their entire lives within a small geographic radius. The tax system that extracted revenue from this population was complex and sometimes arbitrary, but it was also, by the standards of the era, relatively stable in its demands. The Ottoman state was generally more interested in maintaining a population capable of paying taxes year after year than in extracting everything possible at once and destroying the productive base. This was not altruism but pragmatism, and it made for a system of rural governance that, while hardly gentle, was more sustainable than the alternatives in many regions. Cities were a different matter. Ottoman cities were genuine centers of economic life, places where the surplus generated by agriculture and trade was concentrated, transformed, and redistributed. The bazaar was the heart of the Ottoman city, not just economically, but socially and culturally. The covered markets that survive in Istanbul, Cairo, Aleppo, and other former Ottoman cities today give a sense of what these spaces were like, organized by trade so that the spice merchants occupied one section, the goldsmiths another, the cloth merchants another, with each guild occupying its own defined space and regulating the quality, pricing, and membership of its trade. The guild system was one of the fundamental organizing structures of Ottoman economic life, providing mechanisms for apprenticeship, quality control, dispute resolution, and collective identity that gave urban craftsmen and merchants a degree of corporate autonomy within the broader framework of Ottoman administration. Coffee culture deserves its own moment in this story, because the coffee house was one of the most distinctive institutions that the Ottoman world gave to global civilization. Coffee arrived in the Ottoman world from Yemen in the 15th century, and coffee houses began appearing in Istanbul and other Ottoman cities by the early 16th century. These establishments immediately became something more than places to drink a stimulating beverage. They were spaces for socialization, conversation, news exchange, music, and intellectual discussion that existed outside the mosque and the court, spaces where men from different backgrounds could gather, talk, and share information in ways that had no real precedent. The coffeehouse culture spread from the Ottoman world to Europe, arriving in Venice in the 17th century and reaching London, Paris, and Vienna in the decades that followed, where coffeehouses became similarly important centers of commercial networking and political discourse. The coffeehouse as a social institution is one of the Ottoman world's most lasting contributions to global culture, even if most people who drink coffee today have no idea of its Ottoman origins. The food of the Ottoman Empire was, by any measure, one of the most sophisticated culinary traditions in the world. The imperial palace kitchens employed hundreds of cooks, organized into specialized units, responsible for different categories of food, and the range of dishes prepared for the Sultan's table was enormous, drawing on Turkish, Persian, Arab, Byzantine, and Balkan traditions, and transforming them through the particular genius of Ottoman court cuisine. Many dishes that people think of today as distinctively Turkish, Greek, or Middle Eastern, stuffed vegetables, flaky pastries like baklava and burek, pilaf dishes, grilled meats seasoned with specific spice combinations, yogurt-based preparations, all of these have deep Ottoman roots. The cuisine that spread from the imperial kitchens through the empire was one of the most powerful engines of cultural diffusion in Ottoman history, carried by the mobility of the imperial court, by the spread of Ottoman administrative culture, and by the simple human pleasure of eating well. The intellectual life of the Ottoman Empire was more complex and more contested than older historical narratives allowed. The popular image of the Ottoman state as intellectually stagnant, dismissive of science, and hostile to innovation has been substantially revised by more recent scholarship. The empire produced genuine contributions to mathematics, astronomy, geography, medicine, and natural history, particularly in its first 3 centuries. Ottoman scholars translated classical and Arabic scientific texts, built observatories, and engaged seriously with the intellectual developments of their era. The famous observatory of Taqi al-Din in Istanbul, built in the 1570s, was one of the most sophisticated scientific facilities in the world at that time. Destroyed, ultimately not by Ottoman anti-intellectualism, but by the political opposition of religious conservatives and the bad timing of its completion. just as a comet appeared that the observatory's head astronomer interpreted unfavorably. The relationship between Ottoman intellectual life and the scientific revolution happening simultaneously in Europe is still being actively researched by historians, and the older narrative of simple Ottoman scientific stagnation has given way to a more nuanced picture of genuine engagement with the same questions Europeans were asking, combined with specific institutional and economic constraints that limited certain kinds of developments. There is another figure from the Suleiman era who deserves attention not for political power but for naval command: Piri Reis. The Ottoman admiral and cartographer, whose 1,513 map of the world is one of the most extraordinary documents in the history of cartography. The map, portions of which survive and are held in the Topkapi Palace Museum, depicted the coastlines of Europe, North Africa, and portions of the Americas with a level of accuracy that astonished later scholars. Piri Reis drew on captured Spanish and Portuguese charts, Greek and Arab geographical sources, and his own observations as a sailor in the Mediterranean, and assembled them into a synthesis that reflected both the geographic knowledge of his era and the Ottoman capacity to gather and process information from across the known world. His other great work, the Kitab al-Bahriyeh, or Book of Seafaring, was a detailed sailing manual and geographical encyclopedia covering the Mediterranean that remained a standard reference for Ottoman navigators for generations. That an Ottoman admiral was producing some of the most sophisticated cartographic work of the early 16th century is a detail that the standard Eurocentric narrative of the Age of Exploration tends to omit, but it is a detail that accurately reflects the reality of the Ottoman Empire as an information-gathering, intellectually engaged civilization at the height of its powers. The silk trade and its Ottoman dimensions open a window into the economic world of the empire that is often underappreciated. The Great Silk Road trade routes connecting China and Central Asia to the Mediterranean had been partially disrupted by the Mongol period but recovered and reorganized themselves, with the Ottoman Empire sitting at the western terminus of the most important overland routes. Ottoman control of Anatolia and the Levant meant that goods moving from Persia, Central Asia, and beyond passed through territories where the Sultan's customs officials collected duties and where Ottoman merchants participated in the redistribution. The city of Bursa, the first major Ottoman capital, owed much of its prosperity to its position as the endpoint of the Persian silk trade route and its silk weaving industry, which transformed raw Persian silk into luxury cloth, became one of the most economically important industries in the empire. The Venetians and Genoese, who had previously dominated the eastern Mediterranean trade in luxury goods, found themselves in a complex relationship of competition and accommodation with the Ottomans. They needed access to goods that flowed through Ottoman territories, and the Ottomans needed the Mediterranean distribution networks and financial sophistication that the Italian merchant communities provided. The relationship between the Ottoman Empire and the Indian Ocean trade world is one of the most interesting and underexplored dimensions of Ottoman geopolitics. After Selim I's conquest of Egypt in 1517, the Ottomans inherited both the Red Sea trade infrastructure and the political relationships that the Mamluk sultans had developed with the Muslim rulers of coastal India, East Africa, and the Spice Islands of Southeast Asia. The Ottoman sultans made several attempts to project power into the Indian Ocean, building fleets in the Red Sea, establishing a presence in Aden and the Yemeni coast, and at various points dispatching naval expeditions to support Muslim rulers in India against the Portuguese who were forcibly inserting themselves into the spice trade. These expeditions were never fully successful, hampered by the technological demands of long-distance ocean navigation, the difficulties of supplying naval forces at such distances, and the determined Portuguese resistance. But the Ottoman attempt to become an Indian Ocean power, even in its failure, tells us something important about the empire's self-conception as a genuinely world-spanning entity with interests and ambitions that extended well beyond the Mediterranean basin. The question of how the Ottoman state managed the enormous religious diversity within its borders deserves more careful attention than a simple description of the millet system can provide. The day-to-day reality of interreligious relations in the Ottoman Empire was more complicated and more interesting than either the celebratory narrative of Ottoman tolerance or the critical narrative of systematic discrimination. can fully capture. In Ottoman cities, Muslim, Christian, and Jewish quarters often existed in close physical proximity, and the boundaries between them were more permeable in practice than formal regulations suggested. Christians and Jews bought and sold in the same markets as Muslims, hired and were hired by members of other communities, shared water sources and public spaces, and in specific cities and periods developed genuine cross-communal relationships that formal legal categories could not fully contain. At the same time, the formal inequalities were real. Non-Muslims paid taxes that Muslims did not, faced restrictions on certain kinds of public religious expression, and had access to legal protections that were sometimes less than fully equal to those available to Muslims. The empire's non-Muslim communities developed their own strategies for navigating this system, learning to use the formal structures while finding informal routes around their most burdensome features. The Jewish communities of the Ottoman Empire occupy a particularly significant place in this story. The Sephardic Jews who arrived after the 1492 Spanish expulsion settled primarily in the cities of the Balkans and Anatolia, particularly Salonika, where they eventually constituted the majority of the urban population, Istanbul, Izmir, and Edirne. They brought with them the Judeo-Spanish language known as Ladino, which they maintained for centuries as a distinctive linguistic marker of their community, as well as the cultural and intellectual traditions of Iberian Jewry, including expertise in medicine, finance, translation, and the textile trades. The Ottomans deployed Jewish physicians at the imperial court for generations. The court physician Moshe Hamon, who served Suleiman the Magnificent, is one of the best documented examples of Jewish participation in Ottoman court life, and his story of medical service, financial advising, and community advocacy illustrates how individual members of minority communities could achieve genuine influence within the Ottoman system through the deployment of scarce and valued skills. The Armenian community of the empire had a different trajectory. Long established in Anatolia and in the great cities of the empire, Armenians played crucial roles in Ottoman trade and craftsmanship and occupied a position in the millet system that gave their community significant internal autonomy. Armenian merchants were major participants in the trade between the Ottoman Empire and Persia and between the empire and Europe. Armenian craftsmen were responsible for significant portions of Ottoman decorative arts production. The Armenian community in Istanbul, known as the Emiras, included wealthy bankers and financiers who served as important intermediaries between the Ottoman state and European financial markets. This community prospered through the 18th and 19th centuries, producing a bourgeoisie of considerable cultural sophistication that was simultaneously deeply integrated into Ottoman urban life and maintained a strong sense of distinct identity. The catastrophe that befell this community in 1915 was therefore not a conflict between strangers, but a violence perpetrated against people who were, in every meaningful cultural sense, participants in the Ottoman world, whose destruction left a wound in that world that has never healed. The Greek community's trajectory across the Ottoman centuries is equally complex. The Greek Orthodox millet was the largest and, in some respects, the most privileged of the non-Muslim communities. Given the special status that the Patriarch of Constantinople enjoyed as the head of the millet and the cultural prestige that the Greek language carried as the vehicle of Byzantine Christian civilization, Greek merchants, known as Phanariots from the Phanar district of Istanbul, where many of them lived near the Patriarchate, became over the 17th and 18th centuries some of the most sophisticated commercial and diplomatic operators in the empire. They served as dragomans, or interpreters and intermediaries, for the Ottoman government in its dealings with European powers, a role that gave them access to information and influence disproportionate to their numbers. The Phanariots also served as hospodars or governors of the Danubian principalities of Wallachia and Moldavia, exercising real political power in territories that were technically Ottoman vassals. Their networks connected Istanbul to Vienna, Venice, Paris, and the commercial cities of the Mediterranean in ways that made them essential to the empire's function, even as their cultural orientation was increasingly toward Europe. The transformation of the Ottoman economy in the 18th and 19th centuries was driven significantly by the growing commercial power of these non-Muslim communities, and particularly by the system of capitulations that gave European merchants and their Ottoman clients special legal protections. Originally granted as concessions to specific European states in the 16th century, the capitulation system expanded over time to cover an increasing proportion of the empire's commercial activity. European merchants could trade under the laws of their home countries rather than Ottoman law, pay lower customs duties than Ottoman Muslim subjects, and seek legal redress through their consulates rather than Ottoman courts. As European commercial power grew and Ottoman power declined, the capitulations became an instrument of economic subordination, giving European merchants competitive advantages that their Ottoman Muslim competitors could not match. Non-Muslim Ottoman subjects who managed to obtain the protection of a European consulate, something that became increasingly common in the 19th century, gained access to these same advantages, creating a further economic incentive for non-Muslims to orient themselves toward European commercial networks. The result was a gradual commercial marginalization of Muslim Ottoman subjects that fed resentment and contributed to the ethnic and religious tensions of the late imperial period. Understanding these economic dynamics helps explain certain features of the late Ottoman period that are otherwise puzzling. The hostility toward non-Muslim minorities that characterized significant currents of late Ottoman politics was not simply religious bigotry, though bigotry was certainly present. It was also a response to real economic competition in which the structural advantages that the capitulations conferred on non-Muslim traders were visible and felt, particularly by Muslim craftsmen and merchants who were being squeezed out of commercial niches they had previously occupied. The Young Turk period and the later nationalism of the Republican era both drew on this economic resentment in ways that mixed legitimate concerns about economic fairness with ethnic prejudice in combinations that proved lethal. The relationship between the Ottoman center and its Arab provinces is another dimension that deserves more attention than it usually receives. The Arab provinces were the most populous portion of the empire in its later centuries and the site of its holiest cities. Yet Arab participation in the central Ottoman political and military establishment was limited, and the relationship between Arab and Turkish within the empire was characterized by a complex mixture of shared Islamic identity and genuine cultural distance. The Arabic-speaking population of the empire was not a single bloc. It included the cosmopolitan merchant families of Aleppo and Beirut, the Bedouin tribes of the Arabian Peninsula, the peasant farmers of the Nile Delta, the urban craftsmen of Damascus, and the religious scholars of the great Islamic educational centers, all of whom had very different relationships to Ottoman authority and very different experiences of what Ottoman rule meant in practice. The Arab nationalist movements that developed in the late 19th and early 20th centuries were shaped by this diversity, and the Arab Revolt of 1916 that accelerated the empire's final collapse represented only one strand of Arab political opinion, the Hashemite strand of Western Arabia, rather than the whole of Arab political life. The story of the Ottoman provinces in North Africa, particularly in the years before European colonization, reveals an aspect of Ottoman governance that is often overlooked: the extraordinary degree of local autonomy that provincial governors could exercise when they were sufficiently far from Istanbul and sufficiently powerful in their own right. The Ds and Bs who governed Algeria, Tunisia, and Tripolitania operated the Barbary corsair economy, raiding European shipping and coastal settlements for slaves and ransom, in ways that created regular international incidents and eventually provoked European naval punitive expeditions. The Ottoman central government's relationship with these corsair states was one of nominal suzerainty and practical non-interference, collecting tribute and using the corsairs as a tool of maritime policy when convenient but lacking the reach or the will to impose consistent control. This pattern of strong central ideology but variable practical reach characterized Ottoman governance in peripheral regions throughout the empire's history, and it meant that the experience of being an Ottoman subject varied enormously depending on where one lived and when. The relationship between the Ottoman Empire and the European states it bordered and competed with was one of the defining geopolitical dynamics of the early modern world, and it was far more complex than the simple Christian versus Muslim binary that both sides sometimes invoked. France, for example, maintained a formal diplomatic alliance with the Ottoman Empire beginning in 1536, the so-called Franco-Ottoman alliance, which scandalized other European Catholic powers, but which made perfect strategic sense from the French perspective. France was trapped between the Habsburgs in Spain and the Habsburgs in the Holy Roman Empire, and the Ottoman pressure on Habsburg eastern frontiers was useful French foreign policy. The alliance involved military coordination, commercial privileges for French merchants in Ottoman territories called the capitulations, and a degree of diplomatic intimacy that no amount of rhetorical crusading could fully obscure. It was one of history's more honest illustrations of the principle that strategic interest regularly overcomes ideological commitment in the conduct of foreign affairs. The Ottoman relationship with Venice was similarly pragmatic. Venice was simultaneously one of the most important commercial partners the empire had, since Venetian trade through Ottoman-controlled territory was central to the Venetian economy, and one of the Ottoman Empire's most persistent military opponents in the Mediterranean. The two polities fought multiple wars over islands, trade routes, and commercial access, and between wars they maintained active diplomatic relations, with Venetian ambassadors in Istanbul sending back some of the most detailed and informative reports about Ottoman court life and governance that survive from any period. These Beylo reports, as they were called, are among the most valuable historical sources for understanding how the Ottoman Empire actually functioned, because they were written by trained diplomats whose job was to observe accurately and report objectively. They reveal a court and a system of governance that was far more sophisticated, far more dynamic, and far more interesting than the caricature of Ottoman despotism that European polemicists sometimes painted. The relationship with Persia was an almost continuous source of conflict throughout the 16th and 17th centuries. The Ottoman-Safavid Wars were driven by a combination of territorial ambition, control of the crucial Baghdad-Basra corridor, and access to the Persian Gulf trade, and the deep religious antagonism between Sunni Ottoman and Shia Safavid versions of Islam. The wars were expensive, largely inconclusive, and destructive of the territories over which they were fought, particularly Mesopotamia and the Caucasus. The Peace of Amasya in 1555 and the Treaty of Zuhab in 1639 established borders between the two empires that proved remarkably durable and that in many respects correspond to the modern border between Turkey and Iran. The Safavid challenge also pushed the Ottomans to define their own Islamic identity more sharply, emphasizing Sunni credentials and relationships with Sunni religious scholars in ways that had lasting consequences for the religious culture of the empire. The relationship with Russia underwent a transformation of world historical significance. In the 16th century, Russia was a relatively minor player in Ottoman strategic calculations, a distant northern state whose Orthodox Christianity and geographic remoteness made it less urgent than the Habsburgs. The Safavids, or the Venetians, by the late 17th century, that had changed dramatically. Peter the Great's modernization program was converting Russia into a genuinely formidable military power, and his successors, particularly Catherine the Great, would make the Black Sea and control of its northern shores a central Russian strategic objective that brought Russia and the Ottoman Empire into direct and repeated conflict. The wars fought between the two empires from the late 17th century onward were not just military confrontations, but competitions for the allegiance of the Orthodox Christian populations of the Balkans and the increasingly fractious relationship between the Ottoman state and its non-Muslim subjects. To understand why the Ottoman Empire eventually began to struggle in ways its earlier centuries had not, it is necessary to understand several interconnected changes that happened roughly simultaneously in the late 16th and 17th centuries. None of these changes was individually fatal, but together they created a set of pressures that the empire's institutions, designed for the conditions of an earlier era, proved increasingly unable to manage. The first and most fundamental was the military revolution that was transforming warfare in Europe. Firearms, which the Ottomans had adopted early and used effectively, were becoming standard equipment for European armies as well, eliminating the technological edge that Ottoman artillery had provided at critical battles like Chaldiran and Mohacs. More importantly, the tactical use of firearms was evolving in Europe in ways that began to favor the new infantry-based armies being developed there. The tercio formations of the Spanish, the disciplined pike and shot combinations of the Dutch and Swedish, the professional standing armies that European states were developing with their growing fiscal capacities, All of these created opponents who were qualitatively different from the ones the Ottomans had faced in the 15th and early 16th centuries. The Janissaries were still formidable, but they were a professional corps designed for a specific tactical role, and the world was changing around them. The second change was economic. The discovery and exploitation of the Americas by European powers, particularly Spain and Portugal, introduced massive quantities of silver into the global economy. This silver, mined primarily in Peru and Mexico, flowed through European trade networks and eventually into the Ottoman Empire through commerce, and it had profoundly inflationary effects. The price revolution of the 16th century hit the Ottoman fiscal system particularly hard because the Timar system, which provided the backbone of provincial military power and administration, was calibrated to a price environment that had ceased to exist. Sipahis found that their tax revenues, fixed in terms that did not account for inflation, were no longer sufficient to maintain themselves and their military equipment at the standard required for service. The economic logic of the Timar system was collapsing. The third change was demographic and social. The 16th century had seen significant population growth across Eurasia, and in the Ottoman Empire, this meant increasing pressure on land, resources, and the institutions that governed them. In Anatolia particularly, the combination of population pressure and economic disruption produced a series of rural rebellions in the late 16th and early 17th centuries, known collectively as the Salali Revolts, named after an early rebel leader. These were not coordinated, ideologically coherent movements, but eruptions of rural violence by desperate men, often former soldiers who had been demobilized or cheated of their pay. Bandit leaders who recruited from displaced peasants and unemployed rural laborers. The Salali revolts ravaged the Anatolian countryside, depopulating entire districts, destroying the agricultural base that the Ottoman fiscal system depended upon, and demonstrating that the empire's capacity to maintain order in its heartland was under serious strain. The fourth change, and in some ways the most consequential for the long-term trajectory of the empire, was what historians call the transformation of the Janissary Corps. The original Janissaries had been an elite force defined by their separation from civilian society, their direct loyalty to the Sultan, and the excellence of their training. Over the course of the 17th century, these defining characteristics eroded. The ban on Janissary marriage was relaxed, allowing them to form civilian family ties. The Devshirme system fell into disuse, replaced by a system in which Muslims could enroll their sons in the Janissary Corps, converting it from an outsider elite into something more like a hereditary urban militia. The Janissaries began to engage in trade and craft production, becoming embedded in the economic life of cities in ways that gave them civilian interests and civilian political power. They went from being the Sultan's most reliable instrument of authority to being the most dangerous threat to that authority, intervening in succession disputes, deposing sultans they found unsatisfactory, and resisting reforms that threatened their privileges with a ferocity that made meaningful modernization nearly impossible for over a century. The 17th century was also a period of what historians of the Ottoman state call the Sultanate of the Women, a phrase that has generated significant debate. During portions of this century, most notably during the long reign of Ibrahim I and the minority of Mehmed IV, effective political power was exercised substantially by the mothers and female relatives of sultans rather than by the sultans themselves. The most remarkable of these women was Kusum Sultan, the mother of two sultans and grandmother of a third, who wielded genuine political power for decades and who was eventually murdered in 1651 inches, a palace coup that her daughter-in-law Turhan Sultan orchestrated. The story of Kusum is a reminder that the Ottoman palace, for all its formal exclusion of women from the public political sphere, was a space where women could accumulate real power through their relationships with sultans, their control of information, and their management of the harem as a political institution rather than merely a domestic one. Contemporary attitudes, shaped by both Ottoman patriarchal norms and European Orientalist fantasies about the harem, generally assessed female influence on court politics as straightforwardly negative, but more recent scholarship has taken a more nuanced view, recognizing that the women of the imperial harem were political actors exercising the limited forms of agency available to them with considerable sophistication. The 17th century also produced one of the Ottoman Empire's most impressive periods of Grand Vizierial authority, the era of the Köprülü family. Beginning with Mehmed Köprülü's appointment as Grand Vizier in 1656, the Köprülüs dominated the Grand Vizierate for much of the late 17th century, providing a quality of central administration that temporarily arrested the empire's institutional decline. Mehmed Köprülü himself was a man of brutal directness, who executed opponents with a ferocity that shocked even by Ottoman standards, but whose administrative competence and refusal to be manipulated by either palace factions or janissary pressure gave the empire a stability it had badly needed. His son Fazıl Ahmed continued his work with more subtlety and similar effectiveness. The Köprülü era showed that capable central leadership could compensate for institutional problems that were otherwise structural, but it also showed the limits of personal leadership as a solution. When the capable Grand Viziers were replaced by less capable successors, the underlying problems reasserted themselves. The Second Siege of Vienna in 1683 is conventionally treated as the decisive turning point in Ottoman-European military relations, the moment after which the tide definitively turned. The Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa Pasha led an enormous Ottoman army to the walls of Vienna, confident of success, but mishandled the siege in ways that allowed the city's defenders to hold out long enough for a relief army to arrive. John III Sobieski of Poland led the relief force, and the Battle of Vienna on the 12th of September 1683 was a crushing Ottoman defeat. The Holy League, an alliance of European Christian states organized with papal encouragement, followed up the victory with a series of campaigns that drove the Ottomans out of most of Hungary by the end of the century. The Treaty of Karlowitz in 1699, in which the Ottomans formally ceded Hungary, Transylvania, and other territories to Austria and Poland, was the first significant territorial retreat the empire had been forced to accept in its entire history. It established a precedent, and precedents, once set, have a way of being repeated. The 18th century brought both continued military setbacks and something genuinely new: serious, sustained attempts to understand why the setbacks were happening and what might be done about them. The Tulip period, the reign of Ahmed III from 1718 to 1730, and particularly its last decade, is often treated as a frivolous interlude defined by the craze for tulip cultivation that gives it its name. There were indeed elaborate tulip festivals, and an extraordinary enthusiasm for the flower among the Ottoman elite, and the tulip itself, originally a Central Asian steppe flower, domesticated and refined by Ottoman horticulturalists, would eventually be exported to the Netherlands and transform European floriculture. But the tulip period was also a moment of genuine intellectual and cultural opening, when the Ottoman elite began engaging more systematically with European culture, science, and technology, establishing the first Ottoman printing press with Arabic script type in 1727. Sending ambassadors who observed European institutions carefully and reported back, and beginning to ask seriously whether Ottoman military decline could be reversed by learning from European military developments. The printing press deserves more than a passing mention. The printing press had been in use in Europe since the 1450s, and the absence of one producing books in Arabic script in the Ottoman Empire had long been noted. The reasons for this absence were complex and included opposition from the scribal class whose livelihoods depended on manuscript production, as well as some religious reservations about mechanically producing texts that included the Quran. But it was not simple technological ignorance, as the Ottomans were well aware of what printing presses did. When Ibrahim Mutafarrika established the first printing press in 1727, it represented a deliberate political choice to engage with European information technology, and the books it produced, on history, geography, and military matters, were chosen to serve specifically practical purposes. The press did not immediately transform Ottoman intellectual life, but it was a significant symbol of the direction in which a reform-minded segment of the Ottoman elite wanted to move. The Tulip period ended abruptly with a Janissary revolt in 1730 that forced Ahmed III to abdicate. The revolt was triggered in part by military disasters, and in part by popular resentment of the conspicuous luxury of the tulip festivals while the empire was struggling. And it was a stark reminder that reform efforts in the Ottoman system faced a specific structural obstacle: the The Janissaries and other established interest groups that had accumulated power during the empire's periods of institutional weakness would resist changes that threatened their privileges, and they had the capacity to use violence to enforce that resistance. The wars with Russia in the second half of the 18th century were a profound shock to Ottoman self-confidence. Catherine the Great of Russia pursued an aggressive policy of expansion toward the Black Sea, and the wars fought between 1768 and 1774, and again between 1787 and 1792, resulted in Ottoman territorial losses, particularly the loss of Crimea in 1783, and in deeply humiliating peace terms. The Treaty of Kusak-Kaynarka in 1774 was particularly significant because it gave Russia the right to act as a protector of Orthodox Christians within the Ottoman Empire, creating a legal mechanism for Russian interference in Ottoman internal affairs that would be invoked repeatedly in the following century. The idea that a foreign power could claim to speak for a significant portion of the Ottoman Sultan's subjects represented a challenge to Ottoman sovereignty unlike anything the empire had faced before. The response to these challenges, when it finally came in a sustained form, was the Nizam, Asedid, the new order, launched by Sultan Selim III in the 1790s. Selim was a genuine reformer who understood that military modernization was necessary for the empire's survival and who attempted to create a new military corps organized on European principles alongside the existing Janissary establishment. The problem was immediately apparent. You cannot build a new military system while leaving the old, problematic one intact, because the old system will perceive the new as a direct threat and act accordingly. The Janissaries and their allies in the religious establishment opposed the reforms, and in 1807 they deposed Selim in a coup, and he was murdered the following year during an attempt to restore him. The lesson was brutal and clear. Meaningful military reform was impossible while the Janissaries existed in their current form. The question was whether any sultan would have the will and the ability to eliminate them. The answer came with Mahmud II, who became sultan in 1808 and ruled until 1839. Mahmud spent nearly 2 decades carefully building the political support and military capacity he would need for the confrontation with the Janissaries that he knew was inevitable. In June 1826, he finally moved. When the Janissaries rose in their traditional revolt against military reform, Mahmud unleashed loyal artillery units against the Janissary barracks in Istanbul, burning them to the ground with the men inside. Thousands of Janissaries were killed in what the Ottomans called the auspicious incident. The Janissary Corps was formally abolished, its barracks and symbols destroyed, its name erased from official vocabulary. It was one of the most audacious and bloodiest acts of institutional destruction in Ottoman history, and it cleared the way for the modernization program Mahmud had long been planning. But abolishing the Janissaries did not solve the empire's problems. If anything, the challenges multiplied during Mahmud's reign in ways that suggested the problems were not primarily military, but structural and geopolitical. The Greek War of Independence, which began in 1821, was the first successful nationalist revolt against Ottoman rule in the Balkans, and it succeeded not merely because of Greek military prowess, which was sometimes impressive, but because the great powers of Europe, Russia, Britain, and France intervened militarily on the Greek side, destroying the Ottoman Egyptian fleet at the Battle of Navarino in 1827. European intervention reflected the convergence of Romantic Philhellenism among educated Europeans who identified deeply with classical Greek civilization, strategic interests in weakening the Ottoman Empire, and a growing sense in the European concert of nations that nationalist aspirations in the Balkans deserved support. Greece achieved formal independence in 1830, and the precedent was not lost on other Balkan nationalities. The Greek crisis also revealed what would become the defining geopolitical problem of the 19th century for the Ottoman Empire, the problem that European statesmen and journalists began calling the Eastern Question. What would happen to the Ottoman Empire as it weakened? And how could the competing interests of the European powers in the territories it controlled be managed without catastrophic war among themselves? The Ottoman Empire, once a terrifying threat to European security, was becoming, in the eyes of European powers, something more like a managed problem, a declining state whose imminent collapse had to be administered carefully to prevent great power conflict over the spoils. The British statesman who called the empire the sick man of Europe was giving voice to an assumption that had become widespread, not whether the empire would collapse, but when and on whose terms. Ottoman sultans and statesmen were fully aware of how they were being perceived, and the reformers among them understood that modernization was not just desirable but existentially necessary. The Tanzimat era, which began formally with the Gulhane Edict of 1839 issued by Mahmud's son Abdülmecid I, represented the most ambitious and systematic attempt to reorganize the Ottoman state on modern administrative principles. The word Tanzimat means reorganization or reordering, and the scope of what was attempted was genuinely sweeping, a guarantee of basic legal rights for all subjects regardless of religion, the reorganization of the tax system to eliminate tax farming, the reform of the military on European conscription models, the establishment of secular courts alongside the religious ones, the modernization of land tenure law, the creation of new educational institutions from primary schools to universities based on European models, and the building of infrastructure including roads, telegraphs, and eventually railways. The Tanzimat reforms were neither a complete success nor a complete failure, and understanding why requires appreciating both what they achieved and the nature of the obstacles they faced. On the positive side, they created institutions and practices that genuinely transformed significant aspects of Ottoman governance. Secular schools produced graduates who could staff the new bureaucracies and who had intellectual horizons shaped by exposure to European ideas. The telegraph linked the capital to the provinces in ways that dramatically enhanced central administrative control. Legal reforms, while incomplete in their application, created frameworks for thinking about subjects' rights that had not previously existed. The Provincial Reform Act of 1864 reorganized the administrative units of the empire in ways that rationalized and made more efficient the collection of taxes and the maintenance of order. But the Tanzimat also generated contradictions and conflicts that proved impossible to fully resolve. The new secular institutions existed alongside and in tension with the religious ones, creating parallel systems with overlapping jurisdictions and competing claims to authority. The extension of legal equality to non-Muslim subjects, while real in principle, met resistance from both Muslim conservatives, who saw it as a betrayal of Islamic law, and from non-Muslim communities that had sometimes preferred the relative autonomy of the millet system to equal but direct subjection to a central state. The reformers themselves were often socially conservative men who wanted to preserve the empire's essential structure while modernizing its methods, a position that satisfied neither those who wanted more radical change nor those who wanted none. The financial costs of the Tanzimat reforms, combined with the ongoing costs of military modernization and the Crimean War of 1853 to 1856, in which the Ottoman Empire, allied with Britain and France against Russian aggression in the Black Sea region, drove the empire into massive debt. The Crimean War, which the Ottomans called the War in Rumelia, and which Westerners remember primarily as the conflict that produced Florence Nightingale and the charge of the Light Brigade, was itself a significant landmark in Ottoman history. The presence of British and French allies fighting to defend the Ottoman Empire against Russian aggression demonstrated that European power politics had become the framework within which Ottoman survival was negotiated. The empire won the war, more by Allied power than its own, and the peace treaty nominally incorporated the Ottoman Empire into the concert of Europe as an equal member. But the enormous loans the empire had taken to finance the war set the stage for the financial crisis that would eventually force the empire to declare bankruptcy in 1875 and submit its finances to European supervision, a humiliation with profound long-term consequences for Ottoman sovereignty. The Balkan nationalist movements that accelerated through the middle decades of the 19th century were the most immediate expression of the empire's internal contradictions. Each nationality, Serbs, Bulgarians, Romanians, Greeks, Albanians, sought independence or autonomy based on the principle of national self-determination that European Romantic nationalism had made the dominant political ideology of the era. The Ottoman response oscillated between repression and accommodation, and neither approach consistently worked. The Bulgarian uprising of 1876 and its suppression, which produced what British Prime Minister Gladstone called in his famous pamphlet, The Bulgarian Horrors, brought international outrage and Russian intervention. The Russo-Turkish War of 1877 to 1878 resulted in massive Ottoman territorial losses in the Balkans and the formal independence of Bulgaria, Romania, and Montenegro under the Treaty of Berlin of 1878. The empire had lost, in the space of 2 years, some of its most populated and economically productive European territories. It was in the context of this cascading loss that Sultan Abdulhamid II, who came to power in 1876 initially on the promise of a constitutional government, emerged as one of the most complex and controversial figures in Ottoman history. Abdulhamid suspended the constitution in 1878, barely 2 years after it had been promulgated, and ruled for the next 30 years as an autocrat of extraordinary personal control. He created an extensive surveillance system, censored the press with obsessive thoroughness, and built a network of informers that reached into every corner of the empire. He was genuinely paranoid, living in the Yıldız Palace complex on the heights above Istanbul, surrounded by guards and never leaving the palace precincts for long periods. At the same time, he was an intelligent ruler who understood the empire's weaknesses and pursued a complicated modernization agenda on his own terms, building railways, expanding telegraph networks, establishing schools, and attempting to use Islamic solidarity as a replacement ideology for the secular Ottoman nationalism that earlier reformers had tried and failed to instill. The pan-Islamic ideology that Abdulhamid championed, presenting himself as the caliph of all Muslims worldwide and the defender of Islamic civilization against European imperialism, was both genuine political vision and calculated propaganda. The ideology was more consistent than its critics allowed. The idea that the Ottoman Empire could position itself as the leader of a global Muslim solidarity against European colonialism had real appeal in Muslim communities from Egypt to India to Central Asia. But it was also an ideology born of weakness rather than strength, a response to the failure of earlier approaches rather than a confident articulation of a sustainable future. It satisfied no one entirely. The empire's Muslim subjects were facing real pressures that pan-Islamic rhetoric could not address, and the non-Muslim subjects of the empire were alarmed by an ideology that explicitly defined the state around a religious identity they did not share. The Young Turk movement represented the political revolt against Abdulhamid's system by men who had been educated in the new institutions the Tanzimat created and who had been exposed to European political ideas through those institutions. The Committee of Union and Progress, the organized political core of the Young Turk movement, had been developing for years, underground and in exile, when it forced Abdulhamid to restore the constitution in 1908 inches, the face of a military mutiny in the Macedonian provinces. The revolution of 1908 generated enormous popular enthusiasm. Crowds in Istanbul celebrated what they believed would be a new era of constitutional liberty. And for a brief moment the diverse peoples of the empire, Turks, Arabs, Armenians, Greeks, Bulgarians, Jews, marched together in demonstrations of unity that seemed to promise a genuinely inclusive Ottoman future. The promise proved impossible to keep. The Balkan Wars of 1912 and 1913 stripped the empire of nearly all its remaining European territory in a military catastrophe that shocked even those who had been expecting Ottoman military weakness. The speed of the collapse, the vast territories lost in months rather than years, was a traumatic demonstration of how far Ottoman military capacity had fallen relative to its Balkan neighbors, who were now equipped and trained on European models and fighting with nationalist fervor. The loss of Macedonia was especially devastating for the Committee of Union and Progress, since many of its leading figures came from Macedonian cities and identified deeply with a vision of a reformed, European-oriented Ottoman state centered precisely on those territories. In the aftermath of the Balkan defeats, the Committee of Union and Progress consolidated political power in ways that became increasingly authoritarian. The three men who dominated it, Enver Pasha, Talat Pasha, and Cemal Pasha, the so-called Three Pashas, were strong personalities with competing ambitions and a shared conviction that only concentrated, determined leadership could save what remained of the empire. Enver in particular was consumed by a vision of Turkish national destiny and pan-Turanic expansion that would reconnect the Ottoman state with the Turkic peoples of Central Asia. He was brilliant, reckless, and catastrophically overconfident, qualities that would ultimately contribute to the empire's destruction. The decision to enter World War I on the side of the Central Powers, Germany and Austria-Hungary, in October 1914 was the most consequential and most debated decision in late Ottoman history. The decision was driven by multiple factors: the conviction that Germany was the likely winner of the war, the hope that a German victory would roll back the territorial losses of previous decades, the influence of German military advisors who had been deeply embedded in the Ottoman military establishment since the 1880s, and perhaps above all the calculation that a neutral Ottoman Empire would eventually be partitioned by the Entente powers regardless, making alliance with the Central Powers a better gamble than the alternative. The logic was not completely unreasonable given the information available at the time, but the outcomes were catastrophic. The war brought the Ottoman Empire into simultaneous conflict on multiple fronts: against Russia in the Caucasus and eastern Anatolia, against Britain in the Sinai and Palestine and Mesopotamia, and against a British and French naval operation at the Dardanelles. The Gallipoli Campaign of 1915, in which British, French, and Anzac forces attempted to force the Dardanelles and knock the Ottoman Empire out of the war, is one of the most studied military operations in history, remembered differently in different national traditions. For the Australians and New Zealanders who fought there, it is the foundational national myth, the crucible in which their national identity was forged. For the Turks, the defense of Gallipoli was a defining moment of national survival, and the officer who organized the key defensive positions, Mustafa Kemal, emerged from it as a national hero who would go on to reshape what remained of the Turkish world after the empire's collapse. The campaign failed to achieve its strategic objectives, but it cost both sides enormous casualties and demonstrated that the Ottoman military, properly led and supplied, was still capable of effective resistance. The darkest episode of the Ottoman war years was the Armenian genocide of 1915 and 1916. The Armenian population of eastern Anatolia, already subject to severe persecution and pogroms in the late 19th century, was accused by the Committee of Union and Progress leadership of being a fifth column that might support the Russian enemy in the Caucasus campaign. Using this accusation, which applied to an entire ethnic and religious community the crimes of some of its members, the Ottoman authorities organized the deportation of the Armenian population of eastern Anatolia. The deportations were conducted under conditions that resulted in massive death, through massacre by military units and irregular forces, through exposure, starvation, and disease on forced marches through the Syrian desert, and through deliberate killing at specific locations. The precise death toll remains contested, with estimates ranging from several 100,000 to 1.5 million, but the systematic, state-organized nature of the killing campaign, its clear targeting of a specific ethnic and religious group, and its devastating effectiveness in destroying the Armenian community of Anatolia have led most historians and the majority of countries that have formally addressed the question to classify it as genocide. The Turkish state has consistently denied this classification, arguing that the deaths, while tragic, were the result of war conditions rather than a deliberate policy of extermination. This denial, and the historical and political debate it has generated, remains one of the most contentious issues in contemporary Turkish and international politics. The Arab Revolt, that began in 1916, famously associated with the figure of T.E. Lawrence and the Hashemite Sharif Hussein of Mecca, was both a military operation coordinated with British interests and an expression of Arab nationalist sentiment that had been building for decades. The Arab provinces of the empire had been experiencing their own version of the nationalist awakening that was reshaping politics across the Ottoman world. Arab intellectuals in Beirut, Damascus, Cairo, and Baghdad had been developing ideas of Arab cultural and political distinctiveness that sometimes imagined Arab autonomy or independence within a reformed Ottoman state, and sometimes imagined something more radically separate. The British promise, through the Hussein McMahon correspondence, of Arab independence in exchange for support against the Ottomans was deliberately ambiguous, and the gap between what Arab leaders understood they had been promised and what Britain actually delivered would generate political consequences that shaped the Middle East for the rest of the 20th century. When Ottoman forces finally surrendered to the Allied powers in October 1918 with the Armistice of Mudros, the empire was in ruins. The war had been catastrophic in human terms. Millions of soldiers and civilians had died from combat, disease, famine, and deliberate killing. The economy was shattered, the infrastructure damaged, and huge portions of Anatolia had been depopulated by one means or another. The territories that had defined Ottoman power, the Arab provinces, the Balkans, the Caucasus, were gone or going. The Allied powers imposed the Treaty of Sèvres in 1920, which was designed to dismember what remained of the Ottoman state, reducing Turkey to a small rump in northern Anatolia, while granting large portions of it to Greece, Armenia, France, Italy, and an independent Kurdish state. It was, from the perspective of any Turkish nationalist, a national death sentence. The man who refused to accept that sentence was Mustafa Kemal, the hero of Gallipoli, who organized resistance to the Allied occupation and the Treaty of Sèvres from Anatolia in the years between 1919 and 1923. The Turkish War of Independence, as it became known, was a brutal conflict that required simultaneously fighting Greek forces advancing from Izmir deep into Anatolia, French forces in the south, and Armenian forces in the east, while managing the political complications of a puppet Ottoman government in Istanbul that was cooperating with the Allied powers. Kemal's military and political skills were on full display. He organized a national assembly in Ankara that claimed sovereignty in opposition to the Istanbul government, secured arms and support from the new Soviet Union, which had its own reasons to oppose Western Allied power, and conducted a series of military campaigns that systematically reversed the territorial losses the Treaty of Sèvres had imposed. The final and most devastating campaign was against the Greek forces, which had occupied Smyrna, the great port city on the Aegean coast, in 1919 and advanced deep into Anatolia. In 1922, Kemal's nationalist forces broke through the Greek lines in a massive offensive and drove the Greek army to the sea. The Great Fire of Smyrna, which destroyed most of the city in September 1922 and killed tens of thousands of people, most of them Greek and Armenian civilians, remains one of the catastrophes at the end of the imperial period, whose causes are still disputed, but whose consequences were total. The Greek and Armenian communities of a city that had been one of the most cosmopolitan in the Mediterranean were effectively destroyed. The Convention of Lausanne that followed in 1923 formalized a massive population exchange between Greece and Turkey, with approximately 1.5 million Orthodox Christians leaving Anatolia for Greece and approximately 400,000 Muslims leaving Greece for Turkey. It was one of the largest forced population movements in history, creating a human catastrophe of enormous proportions while also, from the perspective of the new Turkish national state, achieving the demographic homogeneity that nationalist ideology demanded. The Treaty of Lausanne in 1923 established the borders of the Republic of Turkey, which Kemal declared on the 29th of October 1923, with himself as first president. The Ottoman Sultanate had been abolished in 1922, and the Caliphate, which had been retained briefly as a symbolic institution, was abolished in 1924. The last Ottoman Sultan, Mehmed VI, had fled Istanbul on a British warship in 1922. His successor as Caliph, Abdülmecid II, was expelled in 1924. The empire that Osman had founded in the forests of northwestern Anatolia 6.5 centuries earlier was gone, replaced by a modern republic that was determined to be something entirely different. Mustafa Kemal, who took the surname Ataturk, meaning father of the Turks, in 1934, pursued a program of modernization and secularization that went well beyond anything the Tanzimat reformers had imagined. The Arabic script was replaced with a Latin alphabet, the calendar converted from the Islamic Hijri system to the Gregorian, the legal system replaced with adapted European codes, religious courts abolished, the fez banned as a symbol of Ottoman backwardness, the public role of religion dramatically curtailed. The new Turkey was to be a secular, Western-oriented nation-state, and Ataturk pursued that vision with a determination that had no patience for opposition. Whether his methods were democratic or authoritarian, whether his vision of Turkish identity required the suppression of Kurdish and other minority identities in ways that created problems that still exist, whether the relationship with the Ottoman past that the new republic imposed was honest or distorting, all of these questions continue to generate intense debate in Turkey and among scholars of the region. The intellectual debate about Ottoman decline has evolved significantly in recent decades, and it is worth understanding where that debate currently stands, because it affects how we interpret the entire later history of the empire. The older narrative, dominant in much of the 20th century, held that the Ottoman Empire began a long, largely inevitable decline from the late 16th century onward, characterized by military weakness, administrative corruption, economic stagnation, and an inability to adapt to the challenges of modernity. This narrative was shaped partly by the empire's successor states, all of which had incentives to portray the Ottoman period as a time of backwardness from which they had liberated themselves, or been liberated, and partly by a European historiographical tradition that equated progress with European modernity and saw the Ottoman world as outside or behind that progressive trajectory. More recent scholarship, particularly from the 1970s onward, has substantially complicated this picture. Historians, including Halil Inalcik, Samal Kafadar, Soraya Faruqi, and many others have drawn on the vast Ottoman archival record to demonstrate that the reality was considerably more complicated than the decline narrative allowed. The empire showed genuine institutional flexibility into the 18th century. Economic life, while changing in ways that the older Ottoman framework struggled to accommodate, remained robust in many sectors and regions. The intellectual and cultural life of the empire, while different from the European Enlightenment trajectory, was not simply stagnant. The Ottoman engagement with European ideas, military techniques, and material culture was more active, more thoughtful, and more ongoing than the decline narrative allowed. What historians have proposed instead is a picture of an empire navigating genuine structural challenges in a world that was changing around it, sometimes successfully and sometimes not, but always more actively and intelligently than the old narrative of passive decay suggested. This revised picture does not eliminate the reality of the empire's eventual collapse or excuse the violence and oppression that characterized aspects of its final decades. But it does suggest that the Ottoman failure, if it is to be called that, was not predetermined by some fundamental cultural or institutional incapacity. It was, rather, the outcome of specific historical contingencies, specific decisions made and not made, specific pressures successfully and unsuccessfully resisted, specific moments of bad luck as well as bad judgment. Empires end. They all end, eventually. The remarkable thing about the Ottoman Empire is not that it ended, but that it lasted as long as it did, and that it managed to leave behind, in the world it shaped, and in the memories of the peoples it encompassed, a legacy of sufficient complexity and depth that its exploration has not yet reached its end. The legacy of the Ottoman Empire is not a single thing that can be summed up in a simple judgment. It is a contested, multifaceted, and still unfolding set of consequences that are visible in the political geography, the cultural practices, the legal systems, the architecture, the food, and the unresolved conflicts of an enormous swath of the modern world. Begin with the geography that the empire's collapse created. The borders of most of the states of the modern Middle East were drawn in the aftermath of World War I by European powers, primarily Britain and France, who divided the former Arab provinces of the Ottoman Empire between themselves in arrangements that prioritized their own strategic interests over the expressed preferences of the populations involved. The Sykes-Picot Agreement of 1916, the Balfour Declaration of 1917, which promised British support for a Jewish national home in Palestine, and the various League of Nations mandates that followed created a regional map that has been a source of conflict ever since. The borders of Iraq enclosed an artificial state that combined Shia Arab populations in the south, Sunni Arab populations in the center, and Kurdish populations in the north, in ways that corresponded to Ottoman administrative divisions, rather than to the ethnic, linguistic, and religious geography of the people living there. The Palestinian question, which has produced more sustained international conflict than almost any other dispute of the 20th and 21st centuries, had its roots in overlapping promises made by the British to Arab and Jewish populations during and immediately after the war, promises that could not all be kept simultaneously. The Balkan states that emerged from Ottoman rule carry an Ottoman heritage that is simultaneously part of their culture and a source of political ambivalence. The legal systems of several Balkan countries have Ottoman roots, modified and adapted over the course of the 19th and 20th centuries, but retaining recognizable structural features. The culinary traditions of the entire region bear unmistakable Ottoman influence. Stuffed pastries, coffee preparation methods, specific spice combinations, yogurt-based dishes, and many forms of grilled meat are common across former Ottoman territories in ways that no national cuisine can claim exclusive ownership of because they are essentially Ottoman in origin, however fiercely different countries claim them as their own. The word for coffee is essentially the same from Morocco to Bosnia to Istanbul to Egypt, kahwa, kahve, kafa, variations on an Ottoman term carried around the Mediterranean by Ottoman trade and culture. The physical infrastructure of many Balkan cities still shows its Ottoman period clearly in the bazaar districts, the khans that served as merchants' inns, the covered markets, the mosques, and their associated charitable complexes that in many cities are now museums or cultural centers rather than functioning religious institutions. In Turkey itself, the relationship with the Ottoman past has undergone a remarkable transformation over the century since the Republic was founded. The early Republican period was defined by a systematic effort to distance the new Turkey from the Ottoman legacy, treating the empire as a period of backwardness and stagnation from which the Republic had rescued the Turkish nation. Ottoman history was taught in ways that emphasized decline and failure. The Ottoman script was abolished with the transition to the Latin alphabet, creating a literal literacy gap between the new Turkey and its own documentary heritage. The average educated Turkish citizen of the mid-20th century could not read documents written a century earlier. The Ottoman past was not exactly erased, but it was reframed in ways that made it more foreign, more distant, and more associated with failure than with achievement. This began to change from the 1980s onward, accelerating dramatically in the early 21st century as Turkey's political landscape shifted under the government of Recep Tayyip Erdogan and the Justice and Development Party. The new political environment was explicitly more sympathetic to Islamic identity and more comfortable with Ottoman heritage, and it produced a cultural reassessment of the Ottoman period that has gone in some ways to the opposite extreme from the Republican dismissal. Television dramas like Magnificent Century and Dirilish Ertuğrul have presented dramatized versions of Ottoman history to enormous global audiences, particularly in the Middle East and other Muslim-majority countries, in ways that emphasize Ottoman glory, Islamic piety, and Turkish national heroism. The Ottoman period has become, in this new cultural context, a source of political legitimacy and national pride rather than an embarrassing reminder of pre-modern backwardness. Historians rightly note that both the Republican dismissal and the contemporary celebration distort the historical reality of the empire in different directions, substituting myth for complexity in service of present political needs. The Middle East today lives with the Ottoman legacy in ways that are sometimes acknowledged and more often not. The religious institutions that exist across the Arab world, the systems of Islamic law, the organizational structures of Muslim communities, the relationship between state and religious authority in countries like Jordan and Saudi Arabia, all of these bear the mark of Ottoman institutional development, even when the political systems that contain them have moved dramatically away from their Ottoman origins. The Hashemite dynasties of Jordan and, until 1958, Iraq owe their thrones directly to the British-facilitated aftermath of the Arab Revolt. itself a product of the Ottoman period. The concept of the Islamic Caliphate, which the Islamic State group attempted to revive with such catastrophic consequences in the 2010s, is intelligible only in the context of the Ottoman Caliphate and its abolition, which created a gap in Islamic political theory that various groups have been attempting to fill ever since. The architectural heritage of the Ottoman Empire is one of its most visible and enduring legacies. The great mosques of Istanbul, Edirne, and other former Ottoman capitals are among the finest buildings produced by any civilization, and they continue to be active places of worship attracting millions of visitors. The Ottoman hands, baths, and caravanserais that survive in cities across Turkey, the Balkans, and the Middle East have been variously preserved, converted, or allowed to decay, but their physical presence is a constant reminder of the commercial and social organization that the empire sustained across its vast territories. Mimar Sinan's buildings alone would constitute a remarkable legacy. The Süleymaniye Mosque in Istanbul, the Selimiye in Edirne, dozens of smaller mosques and charitable complexes scattered across the former empire, bridges that have survived centuries of use, and an aqueduct system for Istanbul that remained in use until the 20th century. The Ottoman contribution to legal and administrative thought is less visible than its architecture, but equally significant. The concept of imperial codes of law operating alongside and complementary to religious law, which the Ottomans developed most fully under Suleiman, was a model of governance that influenced successor states in various ways. The Ottoman principle that the state had an obligation to provide for the welfare of its subjects, expressed in the network of soup kitchens, hospitals, and educational institutions built around imperial mosques, had a social welfare dimension that can be traced through the institutions of successor states. The Ottoman millet system, for all its inequalities, provided a model for managing religious diversity through community autonomy that has been studied and debated by scholars working on models of pluralism in diverse societies. Its limitations were real. The millet system depended on the permanent subordination of non-Muslims and did not provide a basis for the kind of civic equality that modern democratic theory requires. But it worked for centuries across an extraordinarily diverse territory, and that achievement deserves serious reflection. The Ottoman legacy in North Africa is also complex and deep. Egypt, which was part of the Ottoman Empire from 1517 to the French invasion of 1798, and again, nominally, under Ottoman suzerainty until 1882, bears Ottoman architectural and institutional marks throughout its history. The Mamluk Beys, who actually governed Egypt during much of the Ottoman period, operated within a framework of nominal Ottoman authority and genuine Ottoman cultural influence. Libya, which was a formal Ottoman province until 1911 when Italy invaded and colonized it, has perhaps the deepest Ottoman institutional legacy in North Africa. The mosque architecture of Tripoli, the legal framework of Libyan property relations, and certain aspects of the organization of religious life all bear Ottoman marks. Tunisia and Algeria were Ottoman regencies for much of the early modern period, governed by locally powerful military figures called Ds and Bs who acknowledged Ottoman suzerainty while effectively running their territories independently. The impact of 3 centuries of Ottoman institutional presence on the political culture of these countries is real, if difficult to measure precisely. The question of what made the Ottoman Empire last as long as it did is one that historians continue to find genuinely fascinating. Empires in general are fragile constructions, dependent on the ability of a central authority to extract resources from a diverse population and deploy them against both external threats and internal challengers. Most empires that achieve great size collapse within a few generations of their greatest expansion, as the logistical, military, and political demands of maintaining control over vast territories outstrip the institutional capacity to manage them. The Ottoman Empire defied this pattern for an extraordinary length of time, and the reasons why are multiple and interrelated. Institutional flexibility was one factor. The Ottoman system evolved significantly over its 6+ centuries of existence, adapting to changed circumstances in ways that some other long-lived states proved unable to do. The Devshirme system, the Timar system, the Millet framework, the Janissary Corps, even the relationship between the Sultanate and the religious establishment, all of these underwent significant change over time. and the empire's ability to modify its institutional architecture, even when those modifications were sometimes chaotic and contested, was a source of resilience. The empire's geographic position was a second factor. Straddling the intersection of Europe, Asia, and Africa gave the Ottoman state an inherent strategic importance and a role in transcontinental trade that made it valuable to a wide range of actors, even when its own military power was declining. European powers repeatedly found that the costs of replacing the Ottoman system were higher than the costs of maintaining it in modified form, which helps explain why the empire survived in various states of weakness for more than 2 centuries after its peak. The legitimating ideologies that the Ottoman sultans deployed were a third factor. The combination of Islamic religious authority, Roman imperial tradition, Central Asian Turco-Mongol political culture, and the practical track record of effective governance created a legitimacy that was multidimensional and therefore harder to challenge on any single dimension. A sultan who was simultaneously commander of the faithful, Caesar of Rome, and Khan of the Steppes was drawing on more sources of authority than could easily be dismissed or replaced. The Ottoman treatment of diversity was a fourth factor, and perhaps the most interesting from a contemporary perspective. The empire's ability to incorporate and extract loyalty from populations of different religions, languages, and cultural backgrounds, while never fully equal in its treatment of those populations, was more sophisticated and more effective than the alternatives available in its era. The specific individuals who rose to prominence in the Ottoman system: Devshir men from Balkan Christian backgrounds commanding armies and governing provinces, Jewish doctors and financiers advising sultans, Greek and Armenian merchants managing the empire's international trade, Orthodox Christian scholars participating in intellectual life at the Ottoman court, collectively represent a form of managed diversity that drew on the talents of the whole population in ways that more ethnically or religiously exclusive systems could not. The Ottoman Empire was not a tolerant paradise, a common error of oversimplification in one direction. It was a hierarchical, often violent state that extracted resources from its subjects through coercion as well as consent, that discriminated formally against non-Muslims, that used terror as an instrument of political control, and that, in its final decades, committed atrocities that any honest historical accounting must recognize as such. But neither was it the uniquely oppressive, backward, and stagnant system that older historical narratives, shaped by nationalist perspectives of successor states and by the imperial ideologies of the European powers that replaced Ottoman rule in much of its former territory, sometimes portrayed. The reality was more complex, more interesting, and more instructive than either the idealized or the demonized versions allow. What does it mean to think about the Ottoman legacy today, in a world still living with the consequences of the empire's collapse? It means taking seriously the ways in which the borders, the institutional structures, the unresolved conflicts, and the cultural practices of a vast region of the world continue to be shaped by choices made, compromises struck, and violence committed across more than 6 centuries of Ottoman history. It means recognizing that the Middle East's current political landscape is not simply the natural expression of ancient ethnic and religious differences, but is in significant part a product of the specific ways in which the Ottoman state organized and governed its populations, and the specific ways in which that state's collapse was managed by external powers. It means acknowledging that the cosmopolitan, multi-religious, multi-ethnic cities that the Ottoman Empire produced at its best, cities like Istanbul, Salonika, Beirut, Alexandria, and Baghdad in their early 20th century forms, represented something genuinely remarkable that was destroyed by nationalism, colonialism, and war, and whose loss impoverished the human world. And it means sitting with the remarkable fact that a group of frontier warriors from a corner of northwestern Anatolia that barely registers in the historical record before the late 13th century built something that survived for 623 years. From Osman's first independent actions in the 1290s to Mehmed VI's departure from Istanbul in 1922, they ruled territories from Morocco to Mesopotamia. They absorbed the Byzantine Roman imperial tradition and made it their own. They governed one of the most diverse human populations the world had ever seen under a single administration. They built cities and mosques and bridges and aqueducts that still stand. They produced poetry and music and cuisine and legal philosophy and architectural innovation of enduring quality. They shaped the modern world in ways that are still being felt and still being debated. The story of the Ottoman Empire is, among many other things, a story about the persistent human capacity to build something that outlasts its founders, that adapts when it might have collapsed, that creates beauty and meaning in the midst of conquest and coercion, and that leaves behind, in the landscape and the culture and the unresolved questions of the modern world, traces that no amount of historical time will fully erase. The empire is gone. Its traces are everywhere. And the work of understanding what it actually was, shorn of both the myths that glorified it and the myths that condemned it, is work that historians and everyone else interested in how we got to the world we inhabit is still doing and will be doing for a long time to come. There is one final thing worth understanding about the Ottoman Empire that no summary of its political or military history can convey. It was, for the hundreds of millions of people who lived and died within its borders, across 6 centuries, not primarily an empire, but a world. It was the world in which they were born, the world in which they prayed and ate and loved and argued, the world in which they built their houses and buried their dead. Its institutions shaped how they thought about justice and authority and obligation. Its languages and cultures gave them the tools with which they made meaning of their experience. Its collapse was not just a geopolitical event, but the destruction of a world, painful and disorienting in ways that continue to reverberate. And its achievements were not just the achievements of sultans and generals, but of the countless anonymous people, farmers and craftsmen, and merchants and scholars, and architects and cooks and poets, whose daily lives and labors gave the empire its actual substance and made it the extraordinary human phenomenon that it was. To look at the blue mosque rising against the Istanbul sky, or to taste the coffee and sweets in a Syrian cafe, or to listen to the call to prayer echoing across a Bosnian town at dusk, or to walk through the bazaar districts of Aleppo, or Cairo, or Konya, where the Ottoman commercial organization is still faintly visible in the arrangement of streets and trades, is to encounter something that no political treaty abolished and no nationalist mythology has successfully erased. The Ottoman world is still here, in fragments and echoes and unexpected continuities, waiting to be recognized by anyone willing to look closely enough and listen carefully enough to the world they actually inhabit. But there are threads in this vast story that deserve more careful attention before the telling is done. Threads that connect the grand narrative of empire to the texture of actual human experience across the centuries. Consider the role of music in Ottoman civilization, which was far richer and stranger than its relative neglect in Western accounts of the empire suggests. Ottoman classical music, known as Ottoman court music or fasl, developed over centuries into a sophisticated tradition of extraordinary complexity, built on a system of maqams, modal frameworks that define not just a scale, but a set of emotional and temporal associations that specify when and in what emotional context a composition should be performed. A specific maqam might be designated for morning performances, another for late evening, and the relationship between musical mode, time of day, and emotional state was worked out with a philosophical rigor that reflected the influence of Islamic scholarship on every domain of Ottoman cultural life. The composers who worked in this tradition, figures like Itri in the 17th century and Dede Effendi in the early 19th, produced works of lasting beauty that are still performed in Turkey today, though the tradition is now recognized as endangered and its survival is the subject of genuine cultural anxiety. Ottoman poetry, particularly during the classical period from the 15th through the 17th centuries, was a tradition of sophisticated formal artistry that drew on Persian models while developing distinctively Ottoman themes and approaches. The poetry of figures like Fuzuli, who wrote in Turkish, Persian, and Arabic, or Baki, who was Suleiman the Magnificent's court poet and who wrote an elegy on the Sultan's death that is still considered one of the masterpieces of Ottoman literature, operated within a system of conventions and allusions that required extensive literary education to fully appreciate. The imagery of wine, roses, the beloved's cruelty, and spiritual longing drew on Sufi mystical traditions that ran through Ottoman cultural life like an underground river, sometimes explicitly religious, sometimes providing a vocabulary of desire and transcendence that served secular purposes as easily as sacred ones. The Sufi traditions that flourished within the Ottoman Empire represent one of the most significant and least understood dimensions of Ottoman religious life. Sufism, the mystical dimension of Islam that emphasizes direct spiritual experience over legal compliance, existed in complex tension with the official Sunni religious establishment throughout Ottoman history. The major Sufi orders, the Mevlevi order founded on the teachings of Rumi and Konya, the Bektashi order with its distinctive syncretic spirituality that incorporated Christian and Shia elements alongside Sunni Islam, the Halvedi and Naqshbandi orders with their distinctive practices of contemplation and community, all of these operated within the empire under varying degrees of official tolerance and suspicion. The Bektashi order had a particularly interesting relationship with the Ottoman state. It served as the spiritual patron of the Janissary Corps, which meant that its fortunes were tied to those of the army in ways that created both protection and vulnerability. When Mahmud II abolished the Janissaries in 1826, he also suppressed the Bektashi order, demonstrating how religious and military institutions had become structurally intertwined. The Mevlevi order, centered on the tomb of Rumi and Konya, and famous in the West primarily for the Sema ceremony, the whirling practice that gives the dervishes their Western name, was a more socially respectable institution that attracted the patronage of sultans and educated elites while maintaining a rich tradition of music, poetry, and spiritual practice. The Mevlevi lodges scattered across the empire were not just places of religious practice, but centers of musical education, literary culture, and social networking that connected the empire's educated classes across geographic distances. Rumi himself, who wrote in Persian, and whose Masnavi is one of the great poems of world literature, was adopted as a cultural hero by the Ottoman world in ways that transcended the specific religious context of his original teaching. His vision of love as the fundamental force connecting the human to the divine, expressed in imagery of burning, longing, and transformation, resonated across the empire's diverse population in ways that made it one of the most culturally unifying figures in Ottoman civilization. The scientific and medical achievements of the Ottoman world, long underestimated, are gradually receiving more scholarly attention as researchers work through the enormous archives of Ottoman manuscripts that survived the empire's collapse. Ottoman physicians were not simply preservers of Greek and Islamic medical traditions, but active contributors to anatomical knowledge, pharmacology, and clinical practice. The great hospitals, known as Darushifas, that Ottoman sultans built as part of their charitable complexes were not merely expressions of piety, but functioning medical institutions that provided care to patients from all backgrounds. The medical complex at Edirne, built by Bayezid II in the 15th century, was particularly advanced, with specialized wards for different categories of illness, and its approach to the treatment of mental illness, which emphasized music therapy and the therapeutic effects of running water, represented a level of psychological sophistication that contemporary European institutions generally did not match. These hospitals trained physicians and conducted what we would recognize as clinical observation, accumulating knowledge about diseases and treatments in ways that deserve to be integrated into the history of medicine, rather than treated as peripheral to a story assumed to be exclusively European. The Ottoman engineering tradition, sometimes overshadowed by the architectural achievements of the Sinan era, was no less remarkable. The aqueduct system that supplied Istanbul with fresh water was an achievement of the first order, extending for miles across the hills northwest of the city and capable of delivering enormous quantities of water to fountains and bathhouses distributed across the urban fabric. The bridges that Ottoman engineers built across the rivers of the Balkans were engineering achievements that served military as well as commercial purposes, enabling the rapid movement of armies that made Ottoman strategic power possible. The construction of the Süleymaniye Mosque complex involved solving structural problems of genuine difficulty, and Sinan's ability to cover vast interior spaces with stable vaulted roofing while admitting large quantities of natural light through extensive window systems was the product of both mathematical sophistication and accumulated practical experience. There is also the matter of the Ottoman Diplomatic Archive, which is one of the largest and most detailed diplomatic archives from the early modern period anywhere in the world. The Topkapi Palace Archive in Istanbul contains tens of millions of documents covering every aspect of Ottoman governance, correspondence, financial records, legal decisions, and diplomatic communications across centuries. This archive is simultaneously one of the greatest treasures of world historical documentation and one of the least fully exploited, because the combination of Ottoman Turkish script and specialized bureaucratic vocabulary creates barriers that have limited the number of scholars capable of working with it. As more scholars acquire the linguistic and paleographic skills required, and as digitization projects make the documents more widely accessible, the history of the Ottoman Empire is being substantially rewritten on the basis of evidence that earlier generations of historians could not use. The archive is telling stories that have never been told, and its exploration is one of the most exciting frontiers in historical research today. The food culture of the empire deserves one more moment of attention, because it is probably the Ottoman legacy most universally present in the daily lives of people who have never thought about the Ottoman Empire at all. Yogurt, that remarkable fermented dairy product that has become a staple of diets around the world, was distributed globally, largely through Ottoman commercial networks. The specific techniques for making it, the cultures used, the ways of consuming it, the dishes that incorporate it, spread from the Ottoman heartland outward in ways that make it one of the empire's most unexpected contributions to global nutrition. Baklava, that extraordinary pastry of flaky dough layered with nuts and saturated with syrup or honey, exists in so many regional variants across the former Ottoman world and has been claimed as a national dish by so many successor states that it has itself become a political object, the subject of disputed geographical indications and heated arguments about cultural appropriation. The disputes are revealing precisely because they demonstrate how thoroughly the Ottoman culinary heritage has been absorbed into the self-understanding of the cultures that emerged from it. People fight over baklava because they love it and because it connects them to an identity they want to claim. That the identity in question is Ottoman rather than Turkish or Greek or Lebanese is something that the political logic of nationalism makes it inconvenient to acknowledge, but that the flavor itself, unchanged through centuries of transmission, insists upon. The Ottoman world is over, but what it built, what it created, what it destroyed, what it failed to prevent, and what it made possible exists in the present tense, still alive in the cities and institutions and conflicts and tastes and sounds and stories of a world that has not finished reckoning with everything the empire was.